After getting off the phone with Tim, I sent a message to Mikey using my mask. Luckily I still had administrator privileges. He called me a few seconds later while I waited for the elevator to the base. "Hey Tofu, where's the fire?" "There is no fire. Tim said he was doing stuff at the mall and if we go he'd buy me a Cinnabon, so we have to meet him at the mall." "Are you done with your job yet?" "Ha, I figured it was something like that." "Yeah, we were just driving into base. I can meet you in the elevator corridor in a bit." We talked about Tim's plans when the elevator I was waiting for opened, revealing Cindy and Maz in civilian clothing. They looked like they had been talking. "Hey Tofu." "Hello Cindy, hello." "Natasha," supplied Maz. I hadn't known her civilian name, and I should call you. "Just Tofu is fine." "Yo, did you say Cindy?" asked Mikey through the phone, if that was her invite her man. "Why?" I asked, stepping aside to let Cindy and Natasha through. "Why well, she seems cool, why not?" "Cool? I thought she was hot." "Dude, don't just do me this solid, man, come on." "But 2 Cinnabons. Cindy, you have to come to the mall," I blurted, startling Cindy as she tried to walk past with Natasha. "What, why?" "Because Tim and Mikey are going to buy me Cinnabons," I replied, "and Tim said there is a new veercade that he wants to test to try and become a tinker," I added as an afterthought. Thanks. But maybe next TI. She'd love to go," said Natasha, pushing Cindy forward. "What?" exclaimed Cindy, surprised. "Saturday afternoon at the mall. Hanging out with friends. Classic teen activity." I don't really know I was going to." "Oh no you don't. No sitting in your apartment doing laundry or whatever." "I wasn't going to do laundry. Or some other boring thing. You're done with work for the day, girl. Go have fun. Let me live vicariously through you." The two argued back and forth a bit, though I recognized it as the same kind of bickering Mikey and Tim might do. Cindy finally gave in and agreed to go, and left to go grab some stuff from her apartment. Natasha left to make a late lunch for her kids. Parents provide food for their offspring, envy, and I informed Mikey that Cindy was coming and we would meet him in the elevator hall. Cindy arrived shortly, carrying a small bag with many pockets, and wearing different civilian clothes that had less faded symbols, but still wearing her black, elbow-length gloves. We got on the elevator to head to the base. "So, anything I should know about your friends they in the business?" asked Cindy. I looked at her in confusion. Not because of her question, but because her voice wasn't at all raspy. "What's wrong with your voice, Cindy?" "Nothing. This is what it's normally like." "No, it's normally raspy. She sighed and rolled her eyes, "I just prefer to make a good first impression." "Oh. Is it part of your civilian disguise?" "Yes. Exactly. That's what it is." "I see. Anyways, to answer your question, Mikey also works here. He was with me when you gave me the fire extinguisher, and Tim is his longtime friend. Tim doesn't know that Mikey works here, so just be aware of that. Mikey doesn't want him to know about this job." "What should I call you around Tim then?" "Tofu. He thinks Mikey and I work at a warehouse." She shook her head. "K. Hope you know what you're doing." Admittedly, I had miscalculated in using Tofu as my name when I met Mikey and Tim, but I hadn't realized at the time that I would be spending more time with them. It didn't really matter to me so much if Tim found out, but if he did he would find out about Mikey, and that was a large problem for Mikey. I wonder if I needed another alias to go by, but Tim already knew me as Tofu, as did anyone else I wanted to keep in contact with. A different name wouldn't serve any purpose at this point, although I might want to start cultivating alternate personas for when this one eventually failed. Something to think about. We arrived in the elevator hall, where Mikey was already waiting. He was still wearing his domino mask, and seemed a little surprised that Cindy and I weren't wearing ours in the base. Unlike me, Mikey put his mask on every single time he entered the base, even if he was just passing through. I made brief introductions since they already knew of each other, then hurried them into the elevator that would take us closest to the mall. I had a food court to explore. The mall was huge. It was composed of 2 large structures, both 5 stories high and multiple blocks wide. Between the 2 structures was an avenue designated for pedestrian traffic only, which weaved itself in a zigzag pattern from multiple blocks, and was covered by a glass ceiling. There were multiple walkways between the 2 buildings, and if you stood on one near the top you could get a very nice view of the crowds and stores, even if the crowd was a bit thin, and many of the stores were locked up with signs saying, "Closed for summer." Mikey and Cindy were consulting a mounted map of the mall, while I munched on a Cinnabon and watched the crowds. Fun fact, Cinnabons are just very large donuts, with an organic, bitter powder added to them. Still tasty though. Mikey and Cindy located the Viviercade, and we headed off, weaving through crowds and moving up and down escalators, an absolutely fascinating transportation device. The mall reminded me of my first experience in E13, when Jasper was leading me to Maggie's. There was a wide variety of both people and stores, although the stores inside the mall tended to be more high-tech than the ones outside. One that really intrigued me had strange creatures floating through the air outside the storefront. At first glance they appeared to be made of the same glowing energy as Pina and Frankie's powers, but civilians walked right through the fish to no adverse effect. I wanted to buy one of these holograms, but balked when I saw the price. For that kind of money I could buy 50 tofu burgers. Absolutely ridiculous. Speaking of food, there was an amazing arrangement of food vendors. There was of course the Cinnabon, but there was also a Puzzles Pretzels, and I learned that each establishment had its own unique shape for the cheesy treats, Smoothie Shack, and a wide variety of candy vendors. Humans have an amazing mastery of arranging sugar into unique forms. One vendor sold specialty gum that changed flavors over time. Some of them even created swirls of color if you blew a bubble out of them, which Mikey demonstrated for me. Another vendor sold hard candies that were shaped to look like polished stones. Rock candy, lollipops, and something called a jawbreaker as well, which I took to be some kind of challenge until Mikey and Cindy rushed to inform me I wasn't supposed to bite them. An automated mechanical vendor along one pathway sold something called cotton candy, and the machine shaped different colors of the sugary substance into shapes on a stick. One of the shapes available was a stick figure person, which I found confusing. From what I knew about them, humans were quite averse to eating each other. But food in the shape of a human was fine. There was also a dude. If we stop for every single candy store we're never gonna get there, said Mikey. I'm almost done. I hurriedly made my selection and paid for the rest of my candy. There were just so many interesting varieties, I wanted to sample them all. Didn't Sandra tell you to stop wasting your money? Asked Cindy, still without a rasp in her voice. I'd noticed her taking out a small, L-shaped device with a button on top. That she breathed into every now and then when she thought we weren't looking. I'm not wasting it. It's important to sample everything, just in case one turned out to be useful like the MREs. Besides, the taste of sugar was doing wonders to relieve the stress caused by Pina. Maybe Cindy should eat some. She seemed wound up. After a few more escalators, we arrived at a storefront that had 2 large holograms displaying humans in fighting stances. The interior was similar to the arcade on Ashwood St. that I frequented with Mikey and Tim. Except that a large number of the arcade machines had attached helmets and visors. I was the first to spot Tim, and we made our way over to him. He was at a machine labeled Beat Dancer, wearing a visor that covered his eyes and with his bag of gizmos next to the machine. Mikey had to tap his shoulder to get his attention. Hey guys! Isn't this place great? They've even got hard light stuff in the back. Tim trailed off. Noticing Cindy. "Hi there." We introduced Cindy to Tim, using our prepared story about her working at the same warehouse. "Well, hey. That works out great," said Tim. "The hard light chamber I wanted to try was a 4-player. He quickly explained his plan, which was essentially to work with his bag of devices while inside the hard light chamber. But he would need the other 3 players to continue the game and keep it from ending while he did so. Mikey was hesitant. But Tim, absolutely. Positively. Guarantee, that nothing would explode this time. Cindy agreed to help as well, not seeming fazed by mention of explosions. And Tim paid for a session in the hard light chamber. We received, somewhat flimsy, safety gear and blasters from an attendant, as well as a warning to use only the blasters during the course of the game, before heading to the designated room. The game itself involved working as a squad to advance down an endless corridor disguised as an alley. How far you made it down the alley, as well as how many enemies you dispatched with supplied blasters, determined your final score. The walls had large screens behind reinforced glass to provide background. The floor was a slowly moving conveyor belt, similar to escalators. And hard light constructs were used as obstacles. Tim's plan was to assemble and repair items from his bag of devices while inside the chamber, thereby immersing himself in a tinker mindset while in a stressful situation. Theoretically, this would cause a tinker power awakening. We spent the next hour playing and keeping the game running while Tim tried to complete some of his practice devices. The conveyor belt didn't extend to the back of the room, so Tim set up there on the floor at least, after attempting to walk along the conveyor with us, to near disastrous results when his bag of devices spilled, and nearly dumped device parts into the gaps in the treads. As for Mikey, Cindy, and I, we got to work trying to get as far as we could in the game, which was interesting. None of us had used a blaster before. And after I figured it out, I had to tone down my aim in order to match Mikey and Cindy. The harder part was whenever an enemy hardlight construct surprised me, and I had to resist the urge to swipe out with a fist or spit bullets at it. In Mikey's case, I think he was doing rather well for a normal human. But I didn't have anyone to compare him with. Cindy aimed better than Mikey, even while taking out the small device and breathing from it. But I could tell she was tired from the Trebla job earlier today. She was much slower than when she trained with Adder and I. Still, that put her performance above Mikey's. I'd need to make sure he kept going to Adder's training sessions. He obviously needed them. At the food court, the impressive plethora of snack stalls and candy shops on our way to the arcade had apparently not been the food court, which made the real thing all that more impressive. It was the smell that reached me first. Sizzling oil, frying vegetables, spilled sugary drinks, humans, multiple varieties of grease, and even the smell of cooking meat combined into a wonderful aroma that permeated even the large open space in front of me. Food vendors of every description were arranged along the walls, with empty tables spread all around the room to provide places to sit and eat. I didn't know where to start. The others picked out a table at random, and we divided to go pick out our individual choices. Mikey followed Cindy, while I went with Tim. Both because Tim was paying for me, and because I didn't know what to try first. He led me to a stall marked "Tongue-Tied," from which I smelled the distinctive scent of boiling vegetable oil. I ordered a serving of something labeled garlic noodles, and moved back with Tim to wait for our orders. "It's a shame the plan didn't work," I said, to get a conversation going. I was eager to discuss powers again. He sighed and adjusted his glasses. "Yeah. But I'm starting to think Mikey's right. I might just be wasting my time. I frowned. What makes you say that? Well, I've been trying to get a power since I was 10. If I was going to get a power, I would probably have gotten it by now, right? Maybe it is completely random. It wasn't. At least not completely. Of that at least I was sure. Both trigger events I had witnessed so far had been in response to life-threatening situations. And there were sufficient records to indicate that was a common cause of power awakenings. Some might be random. But more likely, it was that the correct stimulus needed for power activation was difficult to achieve. No reason for Tim to give up yet. How many odd summers have there been since you were 10? I asked. What? The one 3 years ago. And the one 5 years before that. When I was 10. You know that. Sure I did. Note to self, look up more historical records. That's what I'm saying. I continued. This is only the third odd summer since you started trying. And it's barely started. Plus, it's not like the experiments when you were 10 had much of a chance of success. Hey! I had a pretty good idea what I was. Mikey told me about the waffle iron. I interrupted. Ah. Heh. My point is, it's much too early to give up now. Setbacks happen sometimes. You just gotta keep a steady pace on it. In fact, I already have the next idea to try. You do? Yeah. Most trigger cases are because someone is in danger, right? But a simulator won't give you that. You need something with real stakes. You think I should put myself in danger? I see, that does make sense. And if he mumbled a bit, staring at the floor, before looking back up to me. And I'm guessing the stakes would involve somehow paying for food. Now you're getting it. I confirmed. Tim laughed. All right. I wanted to give Ali Run a try myself anyways. Whoever scores the most then. Success. I'm glad I was able to convince Tim to keep trying. Right now he's my main source of power research. And winning a game of Ali Run, easiest meal ever. We grabbed our meals when they were ready. Garlic noodles smelled tasty. And sat at the table we picked out. Mikey and Cindy joined us with their own meals. And from that point on we just hung out, chatting about whatever topic came to mind. It was nice. Just sitting and eating with friends. I could see why Natasha had called this a classic teen activity. I had finished my meal. And I was debating going back for seconds when my phone rang. And Cindy's. And Tim's. And Mikey's. And, in fact, every single phone on every single person at the mall. The ring tones had changed to a uniform sound that sounded like an alarm. When I checked my phone, the message, "Assault on the wall, seek shelter," was displayed. I remembered this. In the school's safety assembly they had informed us of this possibility. And had given us the locations of several shelters to seek out if we couldn't find our own. That wasn't good at all. I stood up and grabbed my bag of candy. But was surprised when no one else stood up. In fact, they were looking at me with amused expressions. "Where you going, man?" asked Mikey. With a smirk. "To a shelter, they gave us the info at school. Just give it a moment." I didn't really want to waste time. But admittedly few people had reacted to the alarm. The only people who even looked concerned were several elderly-looking humans. We waited 34 seconds before the phones went off again. But with a less alarming ringtone. The message, "Disregard previous warning, false alarm," was displayed. I sat back down, feigning embarrassment to fit the social situation. "I guess this was normal." "First Wandergeist warning?" asked Tim. "Wandergeist warning. Wandergeist sets off the wall defenses every couple of weeks. All the sectors close to it get buzzed." "I see. That sounds annoying, such an important alarm going off all the time was definitely some kind of safety hazard. You should have been here when it first started, said Mikey. It used to send all the nearby sectors into automatic lockdown. Before they figured out how to make it just a text alert. That was fun for the 3 months it happened. Ha! And nobody has stopped him. Mikey gave me a funny look. Dude. It's Wandergeist. What are they supposed to do? Oops. I didn't actually know what Wandergeist's abilities were. Apparently Wandergeist was a big enough deal that he is common knowledge. Knowledge I was still piecing together one tidbit at a time. Luckily Tim stepped in. And directed the conversation away from my ignorance. Actually the NE15 heroes have been working on a solution to that. Said Tim. They've got an idea using physical traps. Here. I've got the article on my phone. Tim's explanation and a quick, and discreet, search on my phone filled in the details about Wandergeist. First off. I had been wrong in thinking it was a cowl. It was supposedly some kind of powered animal. In possession of an incredible ability called a null field. Inside a specific radius around the creature. Most forms of energy transfer would fail. Including combustion. Electric currents. And even nuclear power. But the most incredible facet was that superpowers would be rendered unusable. Activated powers would refuse to work. And passive powers would simply stop functioning. On top of that, the effective radius of Wandergeist's power was assumed to be nearly half a city block. A ridiculously wide range, which was the reason it set off the wall alarms. The automatic defenses thought the sudden lack of power caused by Wandergeist was a breach in the wall. An utterly unfair ability. But I was confused as to why a mutant or other non-powered method would fail in removing the organism. I clicked a link to show me a picture of it. Beautiful. It was a long-range picture. That displayed a humanoid creature with skin so black it appeared to be absorbing the light around it. It stood on 2 legs. But I could tell from the shape of its limbs that it would be just as comfortable on all 4s. Its legs used a reversed knee joint similar to my favored combat form. And its arms were long with clawed hands at the end. But the absolutely perfect ratios of the limbs. And the precise musculature that I could barely make out put my primitive designs to shame. Even its head was a perfect ovaloid shape designed to deflect and absorb impacts. While giving it 6 eyes an excellent detection range, 2 in the front for binocular vision. 4 on the sides for wide-angle detection. The only design flaw I could detect was 2 segmented tendrils that emerged from the back of its head and draped down its back. I clicked through several more pictures. Confirming that it was 4 meters tall. And much stronger than even its perfect musculature would imply. In one picture it was casually plucking the wheels off a derelict car in the same way I might pull off a normal human's fingers. In another it was snapping an armored mutant male in 2. While a squad of mutants dressed in military gear tried, unsuccessfully, and laughably, to pin it down with primitive weapons. I actually found a video of that fight. And almost despaired when I realized its combat style matched Adder's. With only slight variations to account for frame. Even the tendrils I thought a weakness weren't, they latched onto its own spine at different locations. And if I was analyzing the design right, they were some form of high-speed signal transfer. At several points in the fight they disconnected and reconnected at will to different sections of its spine. Each time creating an optimum distance for transferring signals to the limbs it was using. Maybe its spine was used for something else, either way the system worked. Its limbs moved blazingly fast if the tendrils were latched near them. Superior design. Jealousy. I recorded whatever I could glean from the images. Both its design and movements were valuable information. And I recorded even the grainier images. There was also the abundance of plants in the background of the pictures. Which was an interesting detail, I guess. Sigh. with its ability to nullify supers. An unparalleled physical prowess. Such a creature would destroy me easily. Not to mention that it probably had other tricks up its sleeve. It had apparently been patrolling the area around Southern California for years now. And not sustaining a single permanent injury in that time was telling. Humans were tenacious. I doubted it had been entirely successful in avoiding injury. Maybe it had regeneration likely. At least it was stuck outside Fortress City's wall where it couldn't reach me. Sigh. I added it to the list of entities to avoid ever challenging. Along with Hellion. God. And Mikey's grandmama. I think it's space whales. Said Mikey. Confidently. What, it's obviously a dimensional overlap. Countered Tim. My attention turned back to the conversation. While I had been absorbed with learning about Wandergeist, the conversation had apparently shifted towards where powers came from. Dude. What even is a dimensional overlap? Asked Mikey. It's where two dimensions get superimposed on each other. And rules from both start applying. Several supers have powers that are verified to use the concept. And Dr. Vilgrad wrote a paper about it back in 2098. He talked about an energy wave that propagates at the speed of 4D space when two hypermassive objects collide. Which in layman's terms means powers are the result of two dimensions crashing into each other. If you applied Cecil's theory on supreme receivers, you could theoretically read the wavelength of the energy wave like a library. And just pick and choose whatever power you wanted. Finished Tim. Nearly out of breath. Mikey and Cindy had blank looks on their faces. And I adopted one too to stare at Tim. Or. Mikey finally said. It's magic space whales. Arg! Exclaimed Tim. Grabbing his head dramatically. Then he turned to Cindy and I. Can you believe this guy? Cindy chuckled. Sorry Tim. Magic space whales sounds as plausible as anything else. Ugh. Tofu. Tofu please. Tell me you don't believe in the magic space whales. Pleaded Tim. I don't currently have enough evidence to either confirm or deny magic space whales. Mikey and Cindy laughed. And Tim decided to settle his argument with Mikey by flicking a spoonful of rice at him. Things devolved into a small food fight. Which I unfortunately couldn't participate in since I had finished my meal. But I managed to snag a few pieces of food when no one was looking. So that was good. Hanging out with friends at the mall was quickly proving to be one of my favorite activities. I should invite friends on outings more often. Just needed to figure out how to sneak a 20-ton scorpion into the mall. A note from Goggles Bear. P.S. Out of curiosity. Feel free to let me know in the comments what characters or world aspects you're interested in knowing more about. Every now and then I like to break things up with an interlude. And those can be about almost anything. Chapter 31 Refried. A note from Goggles Bear. Hopefully the editing is fine. I'm not on my home computer. Dude. This is insane. Exclaimed Tim. It is indeed insane. I agreed. I was lying. But agreeing in this situation was the proper social response. Tim had received a notification while we were eating. From one of his webzines. One that specialized in hero information for the Outer East sectors. Apparently it was a fan publication that Tim used frequently. To keep abreast of new information about the heroes of E13 and the surrounding sectors. I had him link me the address. It sounded wonderfully useful. The notification had been due to an update on the villain Trebla's blog. The footage of his fight versus the heroes earlier today had been posted shortly after the fight had concluded. But the notification that alerted Tim was due to the second video to be posted on the site, Ifrits and my fight with the sidekicks. The four of us were now huddled around his phone to watch. Although Cindy and I for different reasons than entertainment. I was just keeping up appearances of being an interested teenager. While Cindy looked a bit pale and worried. Actually. Hopefully there was nothing in the video that would give away her civilian identity. It would cast suspicion on Mikey and I to be working with a powered criminal, although I doubted Tim would suspect his best friend. The best friend designation seemed to give a lot of leeway on social issues. Mikey and Tim often traded insults, but treated them as if they were telling jokes. "Ah, damn it. That's Jennifer," said Tim. His excitement over the video suddenly subdued. "Jennifer?" asked Cindy. "The girl with the glowy weapons. She went to our school," said Tim. Mikey elbowed Tim in the ribs. "Dude, not so loud. And don't go blurting that everywhere." Tim elbowed him back before saying, "She's already out, geez. She triggered in the middle of her fencing match, everybody saw. Still, man. You never know how far it's spread. Some idiots might not even think to check until they hear a rumor. If the wrong person hears, I think she'll be fine. Look at her," said Tim, pointing at the screen. Pina, or Jennifer Hartley as it were, was indeed doing fine for most of the fight. Although that was mostly because we hadn't been aiming to kill her. She, however, was taking full advantage of the fact that her power didn't kill. And on the screen she stabbed Ifrit, which set off the explosion, with appropriate exclamations of surprise coming from Mikey and Tim. And from there things went more or less fine. With only the minor hiccup of having Human.exe forcibly shut down. I was glad to see that even with Human.exe shut down, my actions didn't look too weird from an outside perspective. Right up until I glanced at the others. Tim was staring at the screen with his eyes wide and mouth open. And Mikey was doing the same, except he was looking at me instead of the video. Sigh. That was going to be a conversation later. And why was Cindy staring at me too? She was there. She saw most of it firsthand. I reviewed what I remembered from the fight. Sure. I used a lot of tendrils trying to grapple the shifter. And in a couple spots my limbs bent unnaturally. But that was normal for a shapeshifter. Right, and I hadn't permanently injured anyone. A few broken bones maybe. But bones were nothing, bones healed easy. Wow! Exclaimed Tim, finally breaking out of his daze. I can't decide if that was terrible or karmic justice. Mikey and Cindy turned their stares to Tim. Before Mikey snorted and patted Tim's shoulder. Definitely a bit of both, dude. Karmic justice, am I missing something? Asked Cindy. Tim and Mikey explained their less than pleasant experiences with Jennifer to Cindy. Whereupon Cindy got a thoughtful look on her face before asking. Jennifer Hartley. Yup. That's her. Confirmed Tim. You know her. Well. Not much changed. Confirmed Mikey. True evil is timeless. Unless you throw it in a volcano. Said Tim, looking up at the roof as he stroked his chin. I didn't understand what he meant. But it must have been a joke of some sort because both Mikey and Cindy snickered at it. We finished our meal. And Tim tried to suggest our plan for Alley Run. But it seemed both Mikey and Cindy weren't up for it. Mikey had been moving boxes all day. And Cindy had of course been fighting the sidekicks with me. Although we didn't say as much. We settled on instead trying some of the other games at the Veercade. Stuff that required less walking. Seems they also had a few non-VR games like Gremlins and Ghouls. I was discussing Gremlin Tamer with Tim on the way back to the Veercade. Strangely enough, he didn't play Gremlin Tamer himself. Claiming that he didn't like touch-screen controls. But there was apparently a console attachment you could buy that turned your phone into a true portable console. As well as providing access to a wider variety of games. He pulled his out of his device bag. and showed me how it worked. I wanted one. And Tim said I could buy them at the mall. But they were expensive. I looked regretfully at the bag of candy I was carrying. I may have spent too much on snacks lately. Hopefully the money for the Trebla job came in soon. I was still getting used to the fact that there were things of worth besides food. Weapons. And allies. At this point, I had satisfied most of my survival needs. I had allied with a powerful faction. I had made large strides in improving my combat utility. And I had stockpiled enough energy that I was no longer watching my reserves constantly. Mass at 298% norm. Energy reserves equals 25 days continued operation. Humans pursued objectives that weren't survival-based once all their needs were being met. I didn't have an interest in most of them. Careers, sex, and drugs were all irrelevant to me. Scientific pursuits were useful and interesting. But considering the massive head start humans had, it was more efficient to leave that to scientists and tinkers. For now I would simply continue my research into video games. I had seen them as a way to train for possible scenarios. But humans saw them almost entirely as entertainment. So it was a good starting point to bridge the gap between our ways of thinking. I'd need to divert a few more resources to this goal, instead of funneling everything into acquiring fuel. Still, candy was pretty great. I picked a piece of rock candy out of my bag and ate it slowly. If I mixed a few small flakes of metal in with the candy, it made a strangely satisfying, metallic-sounding screech against my teeth when I crunched down on it. I crunched through a few more pieces of candy, but was then startled when some organic screeches coming from the mall were added to the cacophony in my mouth. The others also noticed. And we moved to the banister that separated the walkway from a multi-story drop. Below us, a swarm of rats was emerging from one of the stores on the bottom floor. They were in pursuit of a small crowd of people. And after a few moments an evacuation warning announcing a rat swarm was broadcasted over the mall's PA system. Strangely, I noticed several humans did not heed the warning until they saw the rat swarm themselves. Whoa! I've never seen a swarm that big before, said Tim. I had to agree. I saw 65 rats down there and counting. And in broad daylight they must be desperate, replied Mikey. Indeed. The swarm was acting strangely. In my experience they hated bright lights, and would attempt to single out a weak target to gang up on using their superior numbers. The rats below were attacking more like individuals than a group, simply picking the closest targets to themselves and rushing them. Even stranger was that the rats were ignoring some easy targets in favor of targeting some of the larger mutants in the crowd. Utterly bizarre. Why would they target a 7-foot-tall mutant with spiked ridges on his arms instead of a 3-foot-tall normal child? Jesus. What the hell are they doing? Exclaimed Mikey. I've never seen them this riled up before. Should we call 911? Asked Tim unsteadily. They're already on their way if they announced an evacuation, said Cindy. She was tapping the banister while scowling down at the swarm. We should get going as well, I said, beginning to herd them away from the banister and towards the nearest exit. Seriously. Humans never seem to react quite as fast as I would like them to. The next exit was located a few stores down, and we turned into a hallway that led to elevators and stairs. On some floors the hallways would also lead to a bridge that connected to surrounding buildings. But there wasn't one on this floor. We were heading for the stairs when one of the elevators ahead of us dinged and opened. And out fell a huge rat. It wasn't as big as the one that had chased me in the sewer. Not by half. But it had barely fit into the elevator. And its face was wrong. Stitches turned its face into a mash of features. And its fur had been removed in other places to allow for larger stitchwork along its spine. Inefficient and sloppy stitchwork. Its muscles were being pulled at bad angles which made its movement stiff and jerky. It sort of gave the impression that it was wearing a rat disguise. A bad one. Inferior design. Estimated threat, low. I wouldn't bet my bag of candy that this rat was made by whoever made the bioweapons. But if I did, I'd feel confident in my bet. That. Sputtered Tim, who had frozen at the sight of it. It was big. But I'd seen bigger. More importantly was how to handle this situation. Killing this thing would be easy for me or Cindy. But we couldn't do so in front of Tim without compromising our civilian identities. Maybe Cindy could lead Tim and Mikey out of the mall while I handled the rat, or maybe I could kill it while Tim wasn't looking. The rat decided for me. After it settled itself into a better stance, it sniffed the air. And its gaze slowly drifted over to us. Before locking onto Cindy. Damn. I had detected that Cindy was a mutant through smell myself. And it seemed the rat was able to determine that as well. Seems this swarm really was targeting mutants. Yeah. That doesn't look friendly, said Mikey. It's not. We should start running. I confirmed. Running would buy me time to figure out how to kill this thing without Tim seeing me do it. It still took a moment to snap Mikey and Tim out of whatever daze they were experiencing. But the rat let out a broken squeak, and that got them all running at top speed. We ran back out of the elevator hall and turned back towards the food court. The large rat lumbering right behind us. Around us. Other parts of the mall were starting to get a bit chaotic. The rat following us wasn't the only large one. And while the larger mutants were fending off the small rats decently well, the big ones gave them trouble. There were also plenty of mutants with only minor mutations, such as extra eyes or limbs, who were no good at combat. A couple people being attacked by rats looked completely normal. But I suspected they had less visible mutations. Similar to Cindy. Our feet pounded the floor as we ran ahead of the stitched rat. But I was already noticing a problem. Tim was no good at running. And Mikey and Cindy were both starting to flag below their maximum speeds. Still tired from the long day of activity. The rat wasn't fast in comparison to the non-stitched variety. But it was still fast enough to keep up with us even if it couldn't reach us. I made sure I was at the back of the group to intercept it just in case. We arrived at the food court, which in the short amount of time we had been away, had devolved into utter chaos. Rats were attacking any mutants they saw, as well as ransacking the food stands. Seems whatever had been done to them couldn't completely override their instincts. This was less than ideal. There was an exit from the mall at the back of the food court. But we would have to traverse the entirety of the food court to get there. Easily done if the goal was to stay alive. But I also did not want to compromise our civilian identities. Nor let Tim and Mikey get injured. The large stitched rat arrived behind us, skidding to a halt in confusion at all the noise and activity. And we were forced to enter the food court to keep away from it. Mikey grabbed an abandoned food tray and flung it at the rat to buy time. In its diminished capacity, I doubted it even registered the hit. But the food on the tray distracted it. "Where should we go?" asked Tim. "Back of the food court. Grab anything you can to fight with," I replied. "And dude, drop the duffel," added Mikey. Tim had been running with the heavy, device-filled bag. "No way." Gasp. "It took too long to get all." Gasp. "Of these," replied Tim. I grabbed the bag from him since it wouldn't hinder me. And we began traversing the food court quickly. Unfortunately, there wasn't much on hand to use as weapons besides food trays. Although they were better than using one of my knives since I could use them to bat rats away. Cindy began knocking rats off anyone we passed. And Mikey and I followed suit. It was a good idea since the mutants would join our group and made a good meat shield. The larger rat was still following behind us slowly. And I made sure to chuck food at it whenever possible to distract it. Whoever it was that modified the rats had certainly made them a lot dumber. The originals would never have fallen for such an obvious deception, although the originals would probably have just taken the food and run to begin with. We got closer and closer to the exit. But the rats were starting to cluster around us. There were simply too many mutants in one spot for them to ignore. And despite how stupid they were acting, there was still a lot of them. We needed a way to split the growing swarm. I smacked a rat away as it leapt at Cindy. The rats were still intent on only attacking mutants. And they ignored Mikey, Tim, and I completely. Only attacking us if we were between them and one of the mutants. The rats were attacking mutants with no visible signs of mutations. So their primary form of tracking was probably smell. I formulated a plan and stuck my hand into Tim's bag of devices. My palm began to rapidly swell as I flooded it with blood and micro units, forming a large pustule that I could wrap my fingers around. I spent energy and sped up my micro units to quickly change the blood stored inside. And had the skin covering it change to a gray, metallic-looking color. Next, I separated the bulbous orb from the rest of my hand, leaving it with only a thin cord of nerves to continue transmitting to the micro units and prevent it from degrading too soon. Then I checked to make sure Tim wasn't looking, and removed my hand from the bag to chuck the orb to the side. To any onlookers it should look like I threw an object I found in his bag. The surface layer of the orb quickly began to break down, releasing the contents, a mixture of liquids and gases meant to simulate the smells of the various mutant samples I had accumulated over the past weeks, as well as whatever I thought would smell appetizing. The orb went rolling over the floor, its ruptured surface leaking the aromatic substance behind it as it went, until the micro unit self-destructed a few seconds from now. It would smell like an incredibly pungent mutant mixed with the smell of grilled tofu. The rats went nuts. Half of the swarm closest to the orb immediately chased it down, while the other half of the swarm tried to run through our group to get to it once they determined we weren't the source of the smell. Some of the rats stayed with us, but most of them were now in a frenzied pile trying to reach the smell source. "What the hell's got into them?" said a large mutant in front of me. This one had horns that curled around the sides of his head for extra protection. "Who cares, let's get out of here," I replied to his likely rhetorical query. Why let them question a good thing the group ran for the exit? And the larger mutant with the horns reached the doors first, slamming one open so hard the glass broke. He didn't get very far before I heard shouts from outside the mall, demanding, "Get down on the ground," and "Don't move." Outside the mall was a wide open space, meant to be an outdoor eating area if the tables and benches were anything to go by. A small squad of police had been heading for the doors before we burst out, and they were now aiming guns at the mutant who had broken the door. Upon seeing them, the mutant had fallen flat to the ground, yelling, "My armbands got torn! My armbands got torn!" Indeed, both the sleeves of his shirt and his arms themselves were quite torn up from the rats. And if he had had armbands, they weren't there anymore. Luckily for him, the police ignored him once they saw the crowd that followed him out of the mall, and they quickly switched to helping evacuate the injured to a corner of the empty eating area. That only changed when the sound of crunching glass came from the mall, and I turned to see the large, stitched rat stupidly breaking through another glass door, ignoring the already open one. "What the hell?" said one of the officers. "That's one of the rats," said an alarmed civilian. And sounds of dismay and alarm rose up from the crowd of people who had escaped the mall. "That's a rat," exclaimed the officer. The police quickly formed a barrier between the rat and the civilians. Yelling a few times for it to cease and desist before opening fire, I guess on the off chance it was a mutant. Whatever modifications the rat might have had. Being bulletproof was not one of them. And it quickly fell to the hail of gunfire along with any of the other rats that followed it out. When it was over, 2 of the police returned to helping the civilians. And the rest entered the mall as a squad. Medical personnel showed up soon after. And started sending people home after checking them out. My group of friends hadn't received any injuries. And we were soon okay to leave after one of the cops had a thorough look through Tim's bag of devices. Everyone was unusually quiet as we walked home. Finally Tim spoke up. "That was pretty gnarly." "Yeah," said Mikey. Apparently too tired to keep the conversation going. "I wasn't the only one who saw the stitches, right?" asked Tim. "They were obvious on the big one." I confirmed. "But all the rats I saw had them. That was so weird." "Do you think they were being controlled?" "What am I saying? They were totally being controlled. Like zombies. And the big one. I've never seen one that big before. Think a power made it grow." "No. I've seen bigger rats. Most likely the person responsible only caused the stitches and odd behavior. Bigger rats bullshit." The conversation returned to normal after that. Tim and I arguing over the maximum possible size of sewer-dwelling pack rats. Mikey chimed in occasionally. But Cindy had grown silent again. I had seen a rat knock her breathing apparatus out of her purse during the melee. But hadn't been able to help retrieve it due to the situation. Likely her voice had returned to normal by now. We eventually reached the point where we had to split up to go our separate ways. Mikey and Tim headed west down Ashwood Street. After saying goodbye. And Cindy covered up her raspy farewell by fake coughing immediately after. I'd have to remember that tactic. We headed in the direction of our apartment building. But the moment Mikey and Tim were out of earshot, she pulled out her phone in a hurry. Talking out loud as she did so. "Need to call Sandra. Those rats were only targeting mutants, this has Espada written all over it." I was rather doubtful that the Espada were responsible. Considering they were all dead. I hesitated on what to say. But finally settled on. Those rats weren't just attacking. They were capturing. She paused and turned to me. "What?" "I saw several mutants pulled away by large groups of rats. That doesn't seem like the Espada's normal operating procedure. That's even worse," she exclaimed. And finished punching in Sandra's number. There was a frenzied conversation. Of which I only heard Cindy's side. Followed by Cindy putting the call on speaker phone so I could discuss what details I remembered with them. I gave an estimate on the size and capabilities of the swarm to her. As well as how many mutants I believed were captured. "All right," said Sandra. "I want you both to head back to base immediately. If the Espada are trying something, I don't want you out and about." "What about the people at the mall?" asked Cindy. "Sorry, hun. We're going to need to leave that to the C's. I don't have anyone that can tackle that right now." "But Sandra." "I'm sorry. But the only cowls we have available right now are Imp and your mother. I can't ask the day-to-day employees for something like this. I could probably track them." I offered. "Absolutely not," replied Sandra. "The tunnels aren't safe. Doubly so if the Espada are trying something. I'm reasonably certain I can handle it. I go down there all the time." "And just why are you going down there when I expressly told you not to? You didn't say not to go into them. You said I shouldn't live in them." "Tofu. That's... Arg." I heard some muffled exclamations that I couldn't make out. Although I did hear Lily laughing in the background. Finally Sandra continued. Tofu. We are going to have a talk about this when you get back. Dang it. Cindy's apartment door thunked closed behind her. Her purse was abandoned by the door. And shoes quickly discarded. Then she dragged herself to her room before flopping face first into her bed. Exhausted. She technically had things to do still. Laundry among them, dang it Natasha. But she firmly decided to put them off until tomorrow. What a day. Sleep sounded good right now. But she was just too wired to close her eyes. Images of the day's events kept flitting past her eyelids when she tried. And she rolled over to instead stare at the ceiling. Probably shouldn't have used the inhaler either, I'm going to have such a headache later. And now I need to bug socket for a new one. Stupid rats. Stupid Espada. They couldn't even give her one afternoon. One afternoon to feel like a normal person. She raised one gloved arm and stared at it. Then she peeled off the black glove, revealing another black glove. Or at least what looked like one. Her hands, from the tips of her fingers to just below the elbow, were encased in an inky black covering. Not quite chitin and not quite skin. The rubbery texture and color made it look like she had dipped her arms in tar. The only change in color was the two glands embedded into each wrist. Looking like purple and yellow bruises if you didn't know better. If she flexed the right combination of muscles, the glands would release their contents into a chamber in her hands, mixing and creating a napalm-like substance that was then ejected from a hole in the center of her palms. Organic flamethrowers. Cindy wasn't sure what esoteric situation could have caused her father to mutate in this specific fashion. But it was the only gift the absentee parent had ever given her. One that was admittedly strong enough to let her contend with supers. Even if she wasn't one herself. And now Jennifer Hartley is. Arg. She punched a nearby pillow. Cindy sighed. Then rolled until she flopped out of her bed. If she couldn't sleep she might as well get something done. She grabbed her hamper and exited to the hall. Intent on laundry. Reaching the dry scrubber in a small alcove off the hall. She opened the lid and started dumping her clothes in. Only taking a moment to make sure each item wasn't too bunched up. The task was unfortunately not distracting enough. And her thoughts turned again to Pina. And then she had needed to be rescued by Tofu, who somehow took one of those spears and kept right on chugging. She would have felt jealous. Tofu had been showing her up almost from the moment he joined. But it was obvious that he had put in the work to obtain his results. Sure. He had an excellent, versatile power that was just dropped into his lap by definition. But that didn't automatically make you good at fighting. And Tofu was good. His form had been rather bad when he started training with Adder. But he still had a fighter's instincts. And had already caught up to Cindy, and didn't that just salt the injury to her pride? Still, his power didn't give him pain tolerance as far as she knew. And when she remembered the spear he had been hit by she shivered. Pain tolerance. Went gaga for simple things like candy. Didn't know what a freaking potted plant was. Was willing to kill, and had. Wherever Tofu had come from. It probably hadn't been a nice place. Which made it all the more incredulous that he somehow had such normal friends. Mikey was in the business sure. But both Tim and he were just about as normal as you could get. Spending the evening at the arcade. And discussing everything from where powers came from. To the most recent Mega B00T album, damn did Mikey have bad taste in music. Had probably been the most fun afternoon Cindy had had in recent memory. The rats might have cut it short. But they'd exchanged numbers with the promise that they'd invite her again. Which she was excited for. She hadn't made many friends in high school, or any. And a supervillain organization wasn't exactly the easiest place to find friends your own age. So the 3 new entries on her contacts list were cause for celebration. Cindy finished loading up the dry scrubber. Then smirked. And I got to witness Jennifer's long-coming beatdown. That thrashing was epic, karmic justice indeed. Maybe now she could finally put that part of her past behind her. Nah. Next time she saw Pina, she was setting her on fire. I don't have the same standards for danger that humans have. A human would look at, say, a swarm of 20 rats, and see impending death. Whereas I would see combat practice, followed by a large lunch, at least. If I wasn't previously cut in half and low on resources. Only a threat to my core mattered. And rats don't exactly use guns. Or have lightning powers. Although I'd be in trouble if they ate my core, I'd seen them eat rocks on purpose. Nevertheless, I had plenty of resources and much more experience now. I wouldn't be caught off guard by rats again. Which is why I thought Sandra was overreacting. What do you mean you were chased by rats? Yelled Sandra. I had been trying to explain why I felt safe in using the sewers. Obviously I had taken the wrong approach. It happened after I escaped Magenta. I had to be rescued that time. But other than that I've never been in danger in the sewer. The job last week. Why am I only hearing about this now? Why didn't you tell anyone? I told Mikey. I meant a lieutenant. Nobody asked. Tofu. That. She took a deep breath and let out a long sigh, rubbing her temples as she did so. Then she faced me and said, "How have you liked being a part of Hellions' henchmen so far?" This was a sudden topic shift. I've liked it a lot. So I can assume you plan to stay with us. Yes. Definitely. Great to hear. Then there is just one thing I'd like to go over with you. She folded her arms on the desk and leaned forward. As you might have guessed, Hellions' henchmen is a bit different from other villainous organizations. Both in how we operate. And in temperament. To date, we've been in operation for over 15 years. When most similar enterprises last 2 to 3 at most. That's impressive. Thank you. Would you like to know the secret to our success? Yes, please. She grinned and leaned in further. Teamwork. Simple as that. It doesn't seem very simple. I've found it to be rather complicated myself. She laughed. Well, I meant teamwork as in a goal we aim for. But thank you for recognizing the minutiae. Keeping so many personalities and experience levels organized is admittedly a full-time job for me and my staff. That's part of the reason we have separate teams, keeps people who cooperate well together. And abrasive personalities separate. I see. Have I been abrasive? No. That's not why I brought this up. You've actually been contributing a lot so far. And we're glad to have you on the team. The point I'm worried about is that you seem to have a penchant for getting into trouble. And then you try to solve it by yourself. Without asking for help. Part of a team is that everyone contributes to the group. But another is that the group looks out for its individual members. The next time you find yourself in one of these situations, talk to us. We can make sure you have proper backup. Or at the very least, help prevent the problem from happening again. All right. All right. I'll keep that in mind. Good. Then I'll let you go. And what you do on your own time is your business. But if you go into the tunnels, take some backup, okay, and not just your friend Mikey. If it's really that important, then you can ask one of our lieutenants. Someone with experience. There's worse than rats down there. Okay, Sandra. I made it back to my apartment rather late. And decided to go to sleep after fixing myself a snack of sugar and leftover burger buns. Normally I could keep human.exe going for days if I needed to. But Pina's power had definitely caused some premature fatigue buildup. I suppose I could just continue on without human.exe, since I had enough resources to avoid torpor. But why bother? To do so would just be an inefficient use of resources. To no immediate benefit, better to sleep. I placed a few sheets of paper that Sandra had given me on the kitchen counter for later. She gave me after-action reports to fill out and return. Strangely, she seemed concerned that I wouldn't be able to read and understand them. But I assured her I would be fine. Admittedly, my understanding of written words had been substandard when I first interviewed with Sandra. But I'd had an entire week of school with which to learn reading and writing since then. I crawled under my bed, but took a few moments to consider what Sandra had said about HH's goals. My understanding of being part of a faction was that the individual benefits were provided because it suited the faction. I received a helmet and suit from HH because protecting its members from death was important to the group's strength. I received food and money because that was a requirement to keep me hired. But Sandra was saying that the overall goal of the group was also to specifically look out for individual members. That was like me looking out for an individual micro-unit. Or cell. It didn't really make sense, but it almost did. Blah. I definitely needed to shut down human.exe for a few hours. I wouldn't figure this out without human.exe. But it was obviously beginning to malfunction again. It had been a long day. Human.exe shutdown. Compiling results. The next day was Sunday. And there wasn't any work. So while I woke myself up promptly at 5 a.m., I stayed under my bed until 5:30 a.m. to go over everything that had happened yesterday. 3 things concerned me: Trebla's concept of living is not surviving, Sandra's concept of the group cares about its members, and the general human concept of entertainment. Of these 3 concepts, the only one I could claim to understand was entertainment. When a human was acquiring everything it needed to survive in excess, it then switched to a form of proactive improvement. The alley run hardlight chamber from yesterday was a perfect example of this. It tested both reactive reflexes and endurance, while presenting the players with the unlikely scenario of having guns and enemy targets that wandered out of cover. While the odds of such a scenario were low, if it ever did happen, we would now be ready for it. Human entertainment covered a wide spectrum of unlikely, but possible, scenarios. A quality I found most admirable. As for Sandra's and Trebla's concepts, nope. I wasn't really getting it. I felt like I could almost grasp Sandra's concept. If I put it in terms of individuals working together for a goal they all wanted. But an entire group looking out for a singular person in a way that wasn't just to retain a valuable member, too strange. But then, HH supplied lawyers to even its non-powered members. Aspects of this concept made some sense. So I'd keep it on the back burner for now. But Trebla's concept was just false: surviving equals living. There was no getting around that. Maybe this was one of those eccentricities that supervillains had. I tabled my musings and left my apartment to head to the base for breakfast. Until 6 a.m. I drank coffee and ate breakfast foods, using the time to chat with the minions coming off of night shifts. Once I was done, I went to the gym and met up with Adder for morning sparring. I took this opportunity to ask her about Wandergeist, and about how its fighting style matched hers. She explained that it was because both of their styles were based on hyper-efficiency, rather than focusing on a practiced selection of combat maneuvers. They focused on thinking multiple steps ahead and applying minimum force to maximum effect. Easy to say, but not as easy to do, as Adder demonstrated by knocking me to the mat while I tried to practice the concept. Real combat was messy, so spending valuable processing cycles on prediction rather than reaction was dangerous. Still, as proven by Wandergeist and Adder, It was scarily effective once mastered. After an hour of practice, I headed to the shooting range to experiment with and practice designs. The slingshot tongue idea had worked rather well, all things considered. Just needed to make a few changes so I could talk while using it. Modifications to the vocal cords would solve that problem. As for ammo, I actually needed something slightly less lethal. If my goal was to leave the target alive, I didn't want to have to maim them before letting them live, as it would cause them to prioritize targeting me in future encounters. I was glad now that Ifrit had warned me against it. I hadn't realized how adverse humans were to superficial damage like losing a hand. Tim had once mentioned there were medical supers who could regrow body parts. So I had thought it a non-factor. I needed non-lethal ammo. To that end, I turned to the decoy design I had used on the stitched rats. While that design had been mostly to lure the rats with smell, I wanted to focus on the fact that it was a non-solid projectile that decayed. When I made something using micro-machines, the resulting object is laced with micro-units that are still connected to my core. The unfortunate result is that anything I make decays in seconds when separated from the signal my core produces. Up until now, I had thought of it as a design flaw. But I might actually be able to use it to my advantage. If I made the projectiles myself, I could time them to decay before impact. And the result would not be as lethal as a solid metal slug or spike might be. I tried a few different variations until I had a design I liked, a small pellet about the size and composition of an eyeball. When I tested it on the targets on the range, it had enough impact to push the lighter targets back, but not enough to put holes in anything. Hopefully this would be a good deterrent without having to maim. But it was so resource intensive, and I couldn't reuse them like metal slugs. Bleh. I'd save these for fragile targets like sidekicks and civilians. At 8 a.m. I wrapped up my experimenting, and after picking up my paycheck, headed to Maggie's Sunrise Diner for another breakfast to regain some of my expended mass. While there, I got into a conversation with the people sitting next to me at the counter seats about lockdowns. None of the eastern sectors had entered a lockdown yet, which was apparently a rarity. Odd summer has officially been declared in effect for 2 weeks now. And while bad things had happened, nothing bad enough to warrant quarantining a whole sector. Why is it odd to not have had a lockdown? I asked one of the older males sitting at the counter. What? Ye daft the walls right over yonder. He replied. Oh, be nice, Harold. Replied an older female. Are you not from around here, young man? She asked me. No, ma'am. I moved here a few weeks ago, I replied. Both of them had accents that reminded me of the way Jasper sometimes talked. There, Harold. You see, young man just moved here. Why don't you answer his questions proper? She said. Yeah. I'm a-getting to it. He turned to me. See, lad. Like I said, the wall is only 3 sectors away. All it takes is fair one particularly nasty critter to get over. And then you gotta lock it down. I thought the wall was impenetrable. Ha! Maybe once upon a time when Overlord was in charge. Rest his soul. But them UNA gobsmackers can't pull their heads out of their R's. Harold. Cough out of the ground without 5 comedies and a permit. Thank God, fair new dawn. Without them we'd be up to our eyeballs in vampires and banshees and other sure. Harold. Stuff. Other stuff. Still ain't as good as when Overlord were around, mind, said another old-timer. To unanimous nods among the older humans. I spent an hour talking and eating with the old-timers before moving on. It was somewhat disheartening to learn that New Dawn Inc. was for the most part in charge of the wall's security, along with the army. The installation I had escaped from had been near S5 or SE5 depending on how well I was judging the distances involved. But apparently there was a New Dawn installation in NE16 next to the wall, which was much closer to E13. The big question was, would New Dawn Inc. become an obstacle? They had spent the resources to create me. And as far as I have seen, I was somewhat unique as a weapon. Was I valuable enough for them to attempt recovery? How long had my ruse delayed their response? Would they even bother to track me down? Could they even track me down with the right super? Anything might be possible. Too many variables. For now I tabled the thought. New Dawn Inc. was a large faction. But Hellions' henchmen had been operating out of E13 for quite a long time now, which made it an ideal place to solidify my position. A stable environment meant predictable factors. If New Dawn Inc. came after me, I'd just have to be prepared. To that end, I spent the next hour mapping parts of E13 I hadn't been to yet. I wouldn't get close to finishing even if I spent days doing it. Even a single sector was absolutely massive, especially the outer sectors. But it made me feel better. I paid particular attention for possible tunnel access points, and food vendors, since knowing about possible escape routes was always a good thing. Especially since the architecture of E13 could vary greatly depending on where you were. It was easy to get caught in a dead end or unsafe alleyway if you weren't careful. One alley I cut through actually had some wires strung across it that I ran into. The annoying things were sharp enough to cut and tangled easily, so I was forced to destroy them with micro units to untangle myself. Annoying. It was probably a tinker-tot trap since it was close to their territory. At 10 a.m. I went back to my apartment building to knock on Cindy's door and ask if she was still coming to the arcade. With the rats attacking the mall yesterday, we had all made plans to meet up at our usual hangout instead. Cindy answered the door, but seemed somewhat dazed. Had she been sleeping? Tofu wa, yawn, yes up. Are you still coming to the arcade? Arcade, ack. Her eyes lit up. Sorry. Give me a moment. I'll be ready in a sec. Once she was ready, we headed off. I found it a bit odd that she had slept for so long. And on a hunch I called Mikey and Tim to make sure they would be there on time. Tim was on his way. But Mikey had been asleep. And he skipped morning practice again. I'm going to have to drag him there, aren't I? Once at the arcade, Tim and I settled our plan to bet on the outcome of games. After trying a few different games, I realized that my reflexes were simply too good to play against him in two-player games like Alley Fighter 2. So I surreptitiously challenged him to beat the high score on some of the single-player ones instead. Mikey and Cindy went to play the two-player games while I tried to give Tim a challenge. But after a while we wanted to do something we could all participate in. And we gave up on power testing to try the four-players games instead. We did that for 2 hours. And then at 12:30 p.m. decided to get lunch at a nearby Mega Burger. I had the triple stack. What should we do next? Asked Tim. I think I'm kinda burnt out on the arcade myself. How about we go see a movie? Suggested Mikey. The others agreed. And we left the arcade to go to a movie theater at 1 p.m. It was a few blocks away, a large, stylized building meant to stand out from the blockier, efficient, buildings. In previous explorations of Ashwoodesty, I had avoided it due to the apparent security at the entrance. Guards constantly checked pieces of paper, tickets. I now knew, presented by entering humans. Mikey bought a ticket for a small group room. And after presenting it to the door guard, we entered the main chamber of the building, where I was immediately inundated by the smell of butter, salt, and something that was slightly burned. Wanna share one big popcorn since we just ate? Asked Tim. Better make that two. answered Mikey. What was he looking at me for? Tim and I got 2 large containers of popcorn. A strange snack that was apparently just for taste and texture, as it had almost no nutritional value. There was also a complimentary soda packet stand. And I stopped to make myself a drink. Ugh. Dude. Did you really mix nectar into there? Said Tim. It's so sweet. How can you stand it? It's my favorite. Ugh. And you already mixed 2 other sodas in there. That stuff is meant for mutants in the first place. You're gonna get kidney stones. I've been fine so far, I replied, brushing it off. I wasn't going to stop drinking nectar if I didn't have to. We went down a corridor that had lots of doors with red and green lights over them. And Mikey led us into the first room with a green light. Inside there were 6 plush seats in a row, all anchored to the floor, and facing a wall that was one large screen. Mikey went to a touch screen that was mounted next to the door and asked, "All right. What do you all feel like watching?" Mikey, Tim, and Cindy all discussed options while I sipped on my soda concoction. I didn't really have a preference beyond not comedy. Humor was still something I hadn't gotten a firm grasp on. And the few times someone had told me a joke, or when something funny had happened, I hadn't reacted appropriately. Tofu. Help us out here. What do we pick? Asked Mikey suddenly. I didn't know enough about movies to answer such a complicated question. So I just blurted out the only movie I knew of. How about the Thing movie you were telling me about? Mikey paused. And then grinned. Ha. Excellent choice. What do you 2 think? That's that one horror movie you keep telling me about, right? Said Tim. Maybe we should watch something none of us have seen. I think that's a great choice, said Cindy, also grinning. That's 3 votes to 1. Sorry, Tim. Seems you can't avoid it any longer, said Mikey, as he hurriedly punched it in. The movie itself was amazing. It depicted a monster with remarkably similar shape-shifting abilities as my own, slowly infiltrating and consuming the occupants of an isolated human outpost. According to Mikey, this movie was made over 100 years ago, before Odd Summer had ever started. Human imagination was truly incredible. As far as I knew, something like me had never been made before. The scientists had specifically called me a prototype after all, so to think they could have predicted a combat scenario involving an organism similar to myself was simply marvelous predictive thinking. There were differences, true, like the creature's ability to replicate. But our strengths and weaknesses were so similar that it was easy to create parallels and begin thinking up countermeasures. I took a lot of notes. You were right, Mikey. My shifting does look a lot like the Thing. Heh. Hope the movie wasn't too on the nose. Mikey replied. No. It seemed very evenly distributed. There was a lot more than just the monster's nose changing. Sure. The movie was about 2 hours long. And Tim had to leave once it was done to attend a family function. Since it was just Mikey, Cindy, and I, we were using the opportunity to discuss topics more related to my abilities. And Hellions henchmen. What Cindy called business talk. Anyways, I wanted to ask. Did anyone from work mention the rats? Asked Mikey. Whoever did it isn't like a client or something, right? Hell no, said Cindy. Hellions henchmen wouldn't work with some dick who attacks civilians indiscriminately. It's probably just the Espada trying something assholish again. Right. That's kinda what I figured, said Mikey, apparently surprised at Cindy's sudden vehemence. Cindy also seemed somewhat embarrassed by her response. Although that was probably because her voice had started becoming raspy towards the end. She covered it up by coughing. And searched through her bag for her inhaler. I talked to Sandra about it yesterday. I supplied. She said that if the heroes didn't take care of it, she'd get some cowls to do it when they got back from their activities. Ah. That's a relief. Wait. There are even more supervillains in HH, asked Mikey. Of course. You didn't think it was just Hellion. Imp. And Socket, right, said Cindy. Kinda. Nope. Most of them are off doing their own thing. As we wandered down Ashwood St. Cindy gave us a more in-depth description of the cowl situation at HH. Most of the details I knew about. But learning about the other real villains that worked with Hellion was interesting. HH operated predominantly on several legal loopholes that labeled minions as accessories to a crime when a supervillain was involved. And not truly criminals themselves. Using this quirk of the laws, HH rented out teams of minions to villains who needed a little extra muscle. Or support. However, this didn't mean that HH didn't have its own cowls. Before Hellion had started Hellion's henchmen, she had been part of a criminal organization that had just begun setting up the Red Zone. That organization hadn't been as neighborly as HH was. And once Hellion triggered, she and other like-minded cowls had ousted the old leadership and set up the Red Zone and Hellion's henchmen in the state they were in today. Many of those cowls, like Socket and Imp, stuck around permanently, while others went off to do their own thing, only coming back if they were needed. One ran several casinos in the Red Zone and almost never left them. Another had been arrested and sent down to Panama. But when his sentence was up, had found he liked the constant warfare and had stayed. As Cindy described more absent cowls, I got the feeling that most of them were eccentric. Wow. I didn't know HH had such a history, said Mikey. How do you know all this stuff, Cindy? How? My mom. Works in the legal department with Sandra. Ah. That's cool. But Cindy, cough cough. Cindy stepped on my foot, signaling me to stop talking. I covered it up nicely, I think. We wandered around a bit longer. Just window shopping. Eventually passing by a store with several mannequins in the display window. They were wearing white dresses, used for something called a wedding, and looked positively impractical. The entire store was apparently to sell just these blah. Why would anyone want non-convenient clothing? Something like these dresses would rip and be destroyed in even the smallest scuffle. That reminds me, would either of you know a good place to buy clothes? I need something that won't rip if I fight in it. I kept meaning to acquire clothes, but somehow never got around to it. Plus, the Thing movie had me leery about not having real clothes. The monster in the movie had been revealed by taking small pieces off of its disguise. And that could easily happen with the fake coverings I had formed. Real clothes would make my disguise more realistic. And as a bonus, I wouldn't need to constantly waste resources shifting to change what I was wearing. Been having wardrobe malfunctions? Asked Mikey, grinning. No. I just don't have any clothes I can use with my power. He frowned in confusion. Oh. Well, what about the ones you're wearing now? They look like they've held up well. Where'd you get them? These aren't clothes. They're made with my power. See, and I briefly shifted the color along one sleeve of my hoodie. But if your power can make clothes, why buy them? Asked Cindy. It still costs calories every time I change them. And if it tears, it bleeds. It's still part of me. Mikey and Cindy were both silent for a moment. Then they looked at each other. Then they looked back at me. Hey Tofu, started Mikey. Shot in the dark here. But if the clothes are part of your body, are you technically naked right now? I thought it over. Technically yes. Both of them took several moments to give me odd looks. Then Mikey threw up his hands in a shrug. Nope. Not as surprised as I thought I'd be. Come on, Emperor. Let's find you some clothes. Follow me, said Cindy. I know a good place. By 3:45 p.m. we made it to an out-of-the-way shop. A few blocks off of Ashwood Estate. Inside it were a few small stands with clothes. But mostly there were mannequins and posters, displaying all manner of mutants in different clothing designs. Seems this store specialized in mutant clothing. I come here all the time, said Cindy. Babs is cool with HH. So you can tell her exactly what you need, Tofu. Alright. Babs turned out to be the owner of the store. She was a tall woman wearing a pinstripe dress, and her straight black hair hung down one side of her head, while the other half was shaved clean. To my distress, she also had a nose ring, with a chain that connected it to an earring on the shaved side of her head. Why didn't humans attach jewelry to less strategically vital parts of their bodies? I'd rather lose an arm than my sensory organs in combat. But humans put all that sharp metal hanging right next to their eyes. I kept all my sharp metal bits internally, where they couldn't be used against me, like any sane individual should. Cindy. What a pleasure, greeted Babs as she approached us. And who is it you've brought with you? This is Mikey and Tofu. We're here because Tofu needs clothes and he's picky. I wasn't picky. Like I told them on the way here. I just hadn't found a store that sold what I was looking for. The clothes they sold were impractical. Didn't fit my disguise. Were too expensive. Or wouldn't hold up under combat conditions. I still regretted that the jacket I took off Frankie hadn't been usable. I hadn't found one like it since. I see, said Babs. She looked me up and down. Then frowned. Then did it again. Moving closer. And staring intensely. It gave me that uncomfortable feeling like when a crowd of people were all looking at me at once. I didn't like having my disguise under scrutiny. I don't recognize any of these, she said. Are they custom? It looks almost like generic brands. But there's too much effort put into the seam work. I don't know anyone with this style either. Curious. I made them using my power, I answered. Then I shifted the color of the sleeve like I had with Mikey. Her eyes widened. And she grabbed my sleeve. Your power can make this. Isn't cloth. It's technically flesh. I'm a shapeshifter. Her eyes grew even wider. If that was possible. Then she grinned. It reminded me exactly of Trebla's smile. The next few hours were interesting. Babs began with closing the store, before barraging me with questions about my power, and having me display some of what I could do. It was basically like working with Socket, except for the lack of dangerous machinery. She seemed especially excited when I told her I could grow extra limbs and mimic mutants. But I balked at doing so since I didn't want to waste the calories. Then she offered to give me several outfits for free if I modeled for her. I did a quick food-to-money conversion calculation, and accepted since buying sugar was cheaper than clothes. For the next 3 hours I shifted and tested her outfits. She didn't ask me to do any of the more heavily modified combat models today. But there was enough variation even among only slightly altered humans to keep me busy. Besides an extra pair of arms. Changing other things like skin color, ethnicity, and sex were all easily done by moving fat deposits and slightly readjusting bone alignments. I didn't keep my skull as one solid piece, which made changing my face easy. Thank you for modeling these pieces for me, Tofu, said Babs, after I had peeled off the final outfit for the day. An odd piece. Meant for someone with 2 right arms and a stronger left arm. Sometimes I get ideas for these outfits and can't resist making them before I realize I have no one to try them. Tinker twitch. Oh no. I'm no tinker. She laughed. Just an enthusiast who gets over-enthusiastic. I moved here to have more customers for my designs. But even E13 can't keep up with my imagination, it seems. I don't suppose I could interest you in a job. Sorry. I already have one. Drat. Well. If you ever have some time, feel free to drop by. I left Babs's store wearing a brand new set of clothing. My t-shirt was made of a durable material that could stretch to multiple sizes. The jeans I was wearing had built-in holes by the knees, which would allow me to shift parts through them, and were guaranteed to last even if more holes got poked through them. And finally, my favorite item, a large and bulky pseudo-leather jacket, with lots of hidden pockets on both the outside and inside. I headed back home, with 2 large bags of clothes in tow. Mikey and Cindy had been almost as interested as Babs in my shifting. But Babs had just kept going and going. So they had both left ahead of me. I would have left a lot earlier myself. But Babs kept promising me more outfits. And admittedly, her knowledge of different styles, and clothing in general, was immensely useful in explaining why humans wore the things they did. I especially enjoyed what she had to say about how certain color combinations and patterns could be used to signify danger. But, as interesting as it was, I had somewhere to be. I hurried home. And by 6:55 p.m. I headed to the base. The Trebla job had been a big job. Therefore tonight there should be a company dinner. Hopefully I wasn't running late. I was looking forward to it. 7H17M34S24NSPM. I was distraught. I'm sorry, Tofu, explained Sandra. But I'm afraid the dinner got cancelled because of this rat debacle. A lot of people went missing. And we're waiting to see what the heroes do before we decide how we're going to handle it. Ah. I see. There's still snacks in the cafeteria. Why don't— her phone rang. Oop. Excuse me, I need to take this. And she began rapidly talking to whoever had called her. Indeed. It didn't seem like a very celebratory mood amongst the minions at the base. While I was grabbing a donut from the cafeteria, I heard multiple mutters amongst the minions such as, "Espada again shit. Do you think they got new recruits?" and "My niece was at that mall. She almost got nabbed." I hadn't realized they'd be so concerned. But apparently the nature of a mass kidnapping had many of the normal employees spooked. I nibbled on my donut. But it only replenished a fraction of the resources I had used shifting all afternoon. I had been expecting a big dinner. I left the base. I needed to make a phone call. Then I was going to go wander down some dark alleys. I had an appetite for meat. Human.exe emergency shutdown. Human.exe displaying behavior harmful to core, analyzing. Calculating. Odds of triggering prospective prey, 0.002%. Odds of encountering non-hero super-powered individual, 0.4342%. Odds of encountering combat design mutant, 67.897%. Odds of lethal encounter in combat scenario, 0.9276%. Odds of discovery, 23.354%. Kernel wipe possibly detrimental to formulating solution, resetting parameters. Restarting human.exe. For 2 hours I had been hunting for rats or dark shriekers, banshees as the old-timers called them, with no success. I didn't come across any organisms in the back alleys south of Ashwood St. Not even any muggers. The irritating lack of prey had prompted me to start calculating the best possible method of targeting a civilian. And I needed to catch myself before I could do something wholly stupid. Tim claimed the chance of triggering was 1 out of 5,000 during odd summer. But I had already caused one inadvertent trigger with the acid woman. I wouldn't risk triggering a second. Especially since I suspected any trigger I caused would give the individual an ability to counter me. Powers were theoretically based on what the organism wanted during the trigger event. And I assumed anything I triggered would want to kill me. The acid woman might have been a nasty situation without the gun. Considering that civilians were the human demographic most likely to trigger. Active hunting of humans would definitely have to be reserved for after odd summer unless absolutely necessary. So, the fact that I had even entertained the notion of hunting civilians was a problem. The thought shouldn't have even been listed among possible solutions. Let alone entered active calculation. The problem stemmed from my human brain. Ever since I gained access to more resources, I had been able to run a more robust and complete version of a human's thought processing organ. This was immensely beneficial, as the predictive abilities of a human's brain was second to none. Comparing my thought processes now to my thought processes before I received human.exe was laughable. Before, I could barely figure out the correct way to bludgeon a brown fur to death. And it took me months to realize that passively reacting to the tests would eventually get me killed. If I had the processing power I had now back then, I would have figured out both in minutes. Not months. Unfortunately, this processing power came with a downside. Namely, all the little quirks that affected human thought processes now also had the potential to leak into mine. In this case I had been angry, which increased aggression, which caused the errant thought of hunting civilians to go into active calculation. Not something that would have happened without human.exe simulating anger for me. I sighed. I had multiple logs in memory of previous kernel wipes. They had dropped in frequency as I got used to using human.exe. But they weren't going away completely. The reduction had stalled. What I needed now was a way to improve. But I wasn't sure how to proceed. The problem was an accumulation of factors between my core, my human brain, and human.exe. But mostly from human.exe. It was what simulated the emotion anger for me. Without it, the closest I could come to an emotion resembling anger was a mild irritation. If that. I didn't experience emotions in the way a human would. And I would be hard-pressed to explain the difference if asked. Even turning off human.exe and attempting to simulate anger on the brain organ didn't create the same sensations for me. It was hard to be influenced by organs when you had full manual control over all of them. So, how to stop human.exe from influencing my decisions with anger and other emotions leaving human.exe off was unacceptable. It handled a large portion of my combat calculations. And all of my social skills. I could remove the sections of the brain that handle emotional processing. But that would affect my social reactions. Plus, when I tried it, several kernel wipes were immediately added to the log. And I didn't notice any reduction in anger from human.exe. I really wish I could access the inner code. I need more information. Humans dealt with emotions every day and didn't get themselves killed. And they couldn't even turn them off. How did they handle this? I pulled out my phone and did a search for anger. Maybe there was a medical manual I could use to better modify the brain. Or maybe a first result, a definition of anger. Second, causes of anger. Third, how to manage anger. Anger management. How to control anger. Anger and aggression, a psychological analysis. Anger management group therapy. And just about a couple thousand more links to related or tangentially related topics. Well, I definitely knew what emotion I was feeling right now, embarrassment. Of course the humans would have researched this already. And in incredible depth. Their proactive problem solving was ever impressive. I opened a few of the links in tabs. And set about reading the different guides on anger management and control. Some of it wasn't applicable to my unique situation. And some of it didn't quite make sense. But what I very quickly realized was that I needed more emotional awareness. It seemed that even humans had trouble realizing when emotions were affecting their logical thinking. And step number 1 was to realize it was happening while it happened. To that end my course of action was clear. I'd leave human.exe running. And my brain unmodified. And proactively identify and catalog the effects of emotions on my thought processes as they occurred, and look up a list of emotions. Apparently there were a lot more than just the base ones I was aware of. Once that was done I'd be able to adjust all my calculations accordingly going forward. Let's see. Figuring out a solution to the emotion problem was pleasurable. A good start. Having solved the most pressing problem, I started walking in the direction of Nicole's den. With my hunting plans a failure I would need to quickly find an alternate source of food I could share with her. I wanted to give Nicole something that would convince her to help with my request, having her escort me in the tunnel system while I investigated the stitch rats. Sandra didn't want me in the sewers without a more experienced person present. And Nicole was the most experienced person I could think of. She'd been living down there for years now after all. A shame I couldn't find a banshee. I'm sure she'd have appreciated fresh meat from an organism she didn't normally have access to. From what I knew about her, she seemed to favor fresh meat. But I think she liked cooked meat as well. At least, she had said the Kobe beef was delicious in her texts. I started parsing through the vendors in the area, Mega Burger, Puzzles Pretzels, The Salad Barbarian, Pizza Place. These were all decent fast food. But I needed something better. Preferably something that actually had a meat option. I couldn't backtrack to Maggie's in time to meet Nicole. Which meant finding another restaurant nearby. But where to go? I scrolled through an online listing of food dispensers for E13. Rejecting one after the other. There was an Italian restaurant nearby. But their online menu didn't have any meat. One restaurant served a soup with real chicken broth. But it was in the opposite direction. If I could just find. Oh. Perfect. The Darksiders Bar and Grill was just as crowded as the last time I came. People eating. Drinking. Arm wrestling. Doing knife tricks. Playing chess. Etc. A unique atmosphere among human establishments. But very similar to large gatherings of Hellions henchmen. It made me wonder if all minion groups had this in common. I approached the bar, a long counter stretching nearly from wall to wall. Unlike most furniture I encountered, the top of this counter was fitted with a polished substance called wood. Supposedly it was the same material paper was made from. And came from an organism similar to my potted plant. But bigger. Paper wasn't too uncommon. But anything made from large quantities of organic material was rare in Fortress City. Presumably due to the dangers of collecting it from the wilderness outside the city's walls. No kids at the bar. Come back when you're 21. Said the bald man behind the counter. The bartender. I didn't recognize him from the last time I was here. I wanted to order food. He frowned. But asked. Whatcha want? Your online menu said you have fish and chips, could I get 2 of those to go? Alright. Wait at a table. I'm serious about the bar. I paid with a chit. Then scanned the room for an empty seat. There were several options. But I recognized one of the chess players, a large, Hispanic man with long, Gray hair wrapped in a braid. He wore sunglasses even though the lighting wasn't very bright. "Hello Teddy. Mind if I sit here?" Who? Oh. The little lost amigo. The heck are you doing in our neck of the woods again? Not lost again, I hope. Not this time. I'm actually headed over to my friend's place again tonight and wanted to buy food. This was on the way. So you did find your little friend. Well, sit. Sit and tell us your tale. Your friend must be quite something if you're making another nighttime run. She is. Ie. Both Teddy and several of the other nearby humans let out multiple raucous noises, as well as jabbing me in the ribs with their elbows. Luckily, I had seen this behavior among humans often enough to know it wasn't an attack. Although I still didn't know exactly what it meant. If my brief experience at school was anything to go by, I had either said something abnormally humorous, said something to embarrass myself, propositioned someone for reproduction, mentioned an accomplishment worth celebrating, or triggered an inside joke. Really. Humans sometimes attached too many different meanings to a single action or phrase. It made parsing through the slang difficult at times. It only took 15 minutes for the fish and chips to be ready. But somehow that was enough time for the crowd around Teddy's chessboard to become denser, rowdier, drunker, and for a small contest to form over who could jab a knife between the splayed fingers of their hand the fastest. Teddy broke this activity up because they were chipping the tables. But I think it was because I was winning. When the meals were ready, Teddy then offered to give me a ride to Nicole's again. "That's all right, Teddy. I know the way now. And let the fries get cold while you waddle your way there. You won't romance anyone that way, cabron. Come on. Nice night for a ride." We headed out to the parking lot and made for his motorcycle, a large machine decked in chrome that was almost twice as ornamented as any of the other bikes. A handful of others followed us out. But Teddy turned back the ones who were drunk. He handed me a spare helmet and I hopped onto the back seat as the Darksiders started their bikes. Each bike gave off a quiet hum as the engine started. And we were soon off down the nearly empty streets. With so little traffic we made great time. And it gave us enough visibility that we spotted a blazing truck well before it entered the approaching intersection. And didn't collide with it as it ran the red light. The two bikers in question nodded and peeled off to pursue the pickup truck. "They are going to track it?" I asked. "Somebody has to. Those flaming heaps are a menace. I thought the police or heroes deal with them." TCH. I wish. Those cars haven't hit anyone yet, so the C's have started ignoring them. Only a matter of time before someone gets creamed. So we've been keeping an eye on them. Are the Darksiders a vigilante group? Ha. Nah. We're nothing that serious. We just keep an eye out for things. Like a neighborhood watch. Anything we find we just try to inform the C's so they deal with it. Or sometimes we pass it on to Hellions crew, cough. Only cause they tend to do something if it's important. Mind you. We wouldn't normally turn to them. But they tend to solve problems faster than the C's. And people need that during odd summer. You know how it is. I do. Teddy dropped me off at Manchineal St. before going on a neighborhood patrol. Apparently a neighborhood watch was a type of communication network, with the goal of identifying threats and passing the information along to someone else who could better handle it. Much more sensible than direct vigilante action in my opinion. Although Teddy did claim that some situations needed to be solved with a knuckle sandwich. It sounded tasty. I lifted the manhole cover that led down to Nicole's den, and climbed down into the dark tunnel. There were some Nessies swimming in the canal next to the ladder. And I had to bop one that tried to see if I was edible. It was the biggest of the small group. And I recognized it as the one Nicole called Mr. Chonkers, a frequent visitor of the canals around Nicole's den. A shame I couldn't just kill one of the Nessies to eat. But Nicole was adamant that they not be harmed. The Nessie's ability to both scour the tunnels and filter the water made them invaluable to her. And she tried to encourage them to inhabit her area. Her efforts were working. There were definitely more Nessies than normal around right now. I made my way around the corner. And spotted Nicole sticking out of her den. She was concentrating on fiddling with a long length of metal pipe. About 6 inches in diameter and over 10 feet long. Hello Nicole. Hey Tofu. 1 second. Just need to get this cut. Just. Right. She was holding the center of the pipe with her mandible claws. And after lining up one of the larger combat claws, sheared a 2-foot portion off the end of the pipe. It fell into the palm of her other large claw, ringing dully against her chitin armor. She raised the piece up to her eyes and examined it critically. Yup. Looks good. What are you working on, Nicole? Just cutting up some pipes. I need to divert some water flow for the Nessies. They like a flowing current. And they're kinda jamming it up right now. Yes. There do seem to be a lot of them. Right, I am not sure what's up. At first I thought they were attracted by that rat swarm I killed. But the leftovers are long gone and they're still coming. So this isn't normal behavior. I looked at the Nessies. Several were poking their heads out of the water in curiosity of Nicole's work with the pipes. Far more than I had seen gathered before were occupying the lighted T intersection where Nicole made her home. Isn't that dangerous? It could be odd summer related. Maybe I've never seen a Nessie trigger though. I'm not sure they have it in them. Either way, they're keeping the place clean enough to run a restaurant out of. So I'm not gonna complain. Speaking of restaurants. Here. I brought food. I pulled out the containers of food, still hot inside, that contained the fish and chips. And we had ourselves dinner. Nicole taking a few token bites before making the usual excuse to withdraw into her den to store the rest for later. I was positive that she must have a second mouth somewhere. Likely attached closer to whatever core she was keeping hidden. Normally I wholly approved of such defensive measures. But in this case I was worried it would hinder my plans. If I couldn't convince her to accompany me, I couldn't search the sewers. I finished up my fish, a breaded, rectangular chunk of oily meat, very tasty. And cleaned up the wrappings while listening to Nicole detail her construction plans for the sewer. I can't tap the water main in just one place, you see. The amount of water I need to increase the flow in this area would immediately alert the city to a leak. And it might cause problems besides. So I plan to make a bunch of small taps in adjacent areas and let the small leaks accumulate into a stronger current here. It sounds like a solid plan. I hope so. The only thing is, I didn't realize how hard it would be to cut the pipes, haha. My rotosaw crapped out on me. And my claws aren't exactly made for precise cuts. I keep crushing the pipe half the time. I can help with that. How long do you need the section to be? Really, about 2 feet long if you can. I grabbed the length of pipe from the floor and measured a 2-foot section. Then I placed my hands around it and set my micro units to work. A brief initial test of the material, mostly bronze, with slight oxidation wherever the protective coating had been damaged. And a few seconds later I had a nice even cut. I handed the piece to Nicole to see the result. Wow! That's even better than a rotosaw. That's so cool. You did this with your power. How does that even work? I thought you were a shapeshifter. Oh. It's molecular, right? You're shifting the atoms around. It's like you're dismantling it instead of cutting. Ack. She had gotten a lot out of such a small display. It was one thing for people to know my abilities, but quite another for them to know how they worked. Best to feign ignorance. I guess so I just sort of do it. I see. But still. That's so versatile. I can think of a dozen uses off the top of my head. I wonder if it would work on reinforced steel. Or tinker composites. That would make accessing the water line so easy. Nicole's eyes drifted as she presumably imagined the different uses of my power. An interesting effect considering she had 8 of them. And most of them went off in different directions. Humans had such interesting mannerisms while thinking intensely. If you want. I began. I could help you install those water flows you were talking about. Oh. I can do that myself. I wouldn't want to be a bother. It wouldn't be any trouble, Nicole. I have plenty of time right now. In fact, I need help investigating the tunnels. So you would actually be helping me out. Alright now, no. I don't have what I need ready yet anyways. Why would you need to go into the tunnels? Whoever made those bodies you found seems to have gotten them to work. And has been upping production. A bunch of modified rats trashed a mall last Saturday. And several people went missing. Oh my God. That's horrible. She exclaimed. One pincer clacking in what looked like a nervous tick. She eyed the claw strangely. And mumbled the next part. Geez. Why wouldn't you mention something like that first? Wouldn't the heroes be investigating this? Though why are you doing it? I'm sure they are. But they're stretched thin at the moment. I've already confirmed that they've needed to let lower priority emergencies go. So the quicker this is dealt with the better. I see, you know. I can just go myself. I'll look for them down here and you can look for them topside. Cover more ground and stuff. It would be best if we both go. I'm expecting a fight once the culprit is found. I would have gone myself. But I was told I'm not allowed to go alone. And I believe that is for good reason. Nicole fell silent. Except for the occasional clack of one of her large claws. Her eyes looked anywhere but at me as she presumably calculated the risk of accompanying me into the tunnels. I found it a bit worrying. Confirmation, detected emotion equals nervous. If she didn't go with me, I didn't know what my next course of action would be. A few casual mentions of the subject back at the base had shown me that most of the minions had absolutely no interest whatsoever in going down into the tunnel system. And I wasn't confident that the lieutenants would be any more eager. If they even had the time. I really needed her help with this. I'll buy you a Cinnabon. Her eyes blinked as she focused back on me. What? A Cinnabon. They sell them at the mall and they're tasty. Nicole stared at me as a very awkward silence descended. I was worried that I said something rude. When she broke the silence with a half-hearted chuckle. It's fine, tofu. I wouldn't ignore a problem like this. I'll go with you. It'll have to wait until tomorrow though. I really do need to get some stuff together. Make sure you bring anything you might need. You'll be slogging through a sewer after all. And the Cinnabons. 2 of them for me. If you're gonna bribe me, it won't be cheap, you know. You got it. We made plans to meet the next day around noon. And I left Nicole so she could make her arrangements undistracted. I myself planned to visit the grocery store to top off my reserves. And then let human.exe sleep for the night. Whatever we encountered in the tunnels tomorrow, I would be ready for it. The emotion I was feeling this time was quite familiar to me, satisfaction. The next morning, I made sure all my knives and ammunition were in order. Then attended practice as usual with Adder. Afterwards, I sat in the cafeteria eating breakfast, toast with jelly, while calculating possible combat scenarios for the day. I had familiarized myself with the tunnels underneath Maggie's diner when I first started living in E13. But admittedly, I couldn't make an accurate risk assessment from just that. Everyone I met seemed to be wary of the tunnels under Fortress City. So there must be some threat that I didn't know about. Maybe some large predator I had yet to encounter, other bioweapons. Like Jasper had mentioned, some kind of big metal trap device, like a puzzle test. Proactive risk prediction was harder than it seemed. Humans made it look easy. Maybe I'd just do some target practice instead. Hey Tofu. Just the guy we were looking for. I turned to see two familiar faces. Hello Brilla. Hello Fred. You were looking for me. Well. Not so much you. And more so anyone we can drag along as muscle. Replied Brilla. Ah. Sorry. But I actually had plans for today. Aha. And do those plans include eating on the company dime? While poor Fred and I need to work without protection all alone in a cruel world. I didn't. All because Pebbles and Buzzer, who were supposed to be helping us, are in the slammer because someone forgot to drag them along. Will it take long? Just an hour or two. Meet ya in the garage. Toodles. Brilla headed off in the direction of the garage, Fred giving me an apologetic smile as he followed her. Humph. Another emotion I was familiar with, frustration. So what are we doing anyway? Asked Gregor. He had also gotten pulled into helping Fred and Brilla. And the four of us had headed out in a van. We're headed to the pit, replied Fred. Illegal fight arena in the red zone. Run by a guy named Ivan Beltoni. Seems some trouble went down at his place. And he wants us to look into it. He's a sleazy crook. But he pays good money to Hellion. So try not to piss him off. When we reached the red zone, Fred and Brilla led us to a building that looked far more subdued than the red zone's normally brightly lit entertainment establishments. It almost looked like a warehouse. And would have stuck out if it wasn't hidden off the main thoroughfare of the red zone, surrounded by other shadowed structures that likely contained all the resources it took to keep the entertainment district running. All of the food and illegal products had to be stored somewhere after all. Fred rapped his fist against a solid iron door set into the wall of the building. A small opening at eye level slid open. And the door quickly slid to the side to let us in. The door watcher was a skinny man, with dark blotches under his eyes. He gestured with a hand to follow. Boss is this way. He led us down a dim hallway. But we emerged into a large, brightly lit rectangular room. Along the walls were benches arranged on a slope to give maximum visibility. And at the center of the room was a raised stage encased in a chain-linked cage. 2 mutants were currently in the cage. One with 4 arms and chitinous growths along his shoulders and the other with a bone exoskeleton that encased his head, neck, and most of his upper torso. The 2 of them were fighting. But it appeared to be a training exercise, as they were only throwing punches. And neither of them was actually trying to kill their opponent. I recognized this place. It was a test chamber. True. It wasn't as sophisticated as the one I was made in. But it had the bare minimum of a combat area. And a place for the scientists to sit and observe. I did have to wonder about the safety precautions though. That cage wouldn't hold if a brown fur went berserk. Let alone if a yellow fur triggered. So, the boneheads finally decide to show. Take a break you two, he directed at the fighters. Try not to suck so much next time. The 2 mutants left through a gate set into the side of the cage. One of them nursing a bloody nose. From the suited man's demeanor, I assumed this was Beltoni. Heard you had some trouble last night, mister. Beltoni, said Fred. They hurt your fighters. Seth was returning from a side room, wheeling a pallet whose contents were covered by a tarp. He lifted the tarp to the side to show us the corpse of a dead stitched rat. One of the big gray ones like I had seen in the mall. The stitches and scars that marked the surgery were clearly visible. "Ugly thing, ain't it?" said Beltoni. "Saved the best one for you. Someone's playing Frankenstein. Never seen them this big before. They can get even bigger. But this is definitely one of the stitched rats from the mall," I said. "No worries, Mr. Beltoni. We'll be looking into this for sure. Gregor. Tofu. Take this thing down to the van. I think we'll take it to Stitcher's. See what we're dealing with," said Fred. Gregor wrapped the tarp back over the corpse and grabbed the front half, while I grabbed the back half. Together we easily lifted it, and set about taking it to the van. "Shit. Hellion always snaps up the good muties," said Beltoni. "Either of you interested in making some side money?" "No," said Gregor. "I'm not a mutant," I replied. "Bah. Useless. What about you good lookin'?" he directed at Brilla. "Wanna make some dough easier than for them? More fun too." Brilla responded with a rude gesture and started walking away. "I thought we weren't supposed to try and anger him, heh? That's how they all are at first," finished Beltoni. Fred and Brilla led us on an alternate, and less frequented, path to the van, citing that seeing two minions hauling a dead body might be a bit too spooky for the tourists. It seemed a bit weird that they would like seeing Beltoni's fighters kill the rats, but not like seeing the body afterwards. Speaking of fights, "Do you think Beltoni would let me fight if I promised not to shape-shift?" I asked. "It would be a great way to practice and earn money at the same time." "I think you should probably avoid that place, Tofu," said Fred. "Why?" "Because a place like that turns men into animals," replied Gregor. "And animals into Beltoni," added Brilla. "You can practically feel the desperation in that place." I considered their advice. I hadn't expected such negative responses. I also hadn't picked up on the negative connotations of Beltoni's establishment. Nor had I felt desperate there. A caged fighting stage. Physical harm. An audience that wanted to see violence. The owner of the place caring nothing for the safety of the fighters. Blood. It was much harder to identify what emotion the pit made me feel. But if I had to identify it. Nostalgic Mutavis mutations can be broadly categorized into 4 general categories. The first being minor internal mutations. These are alterations such as a modified heart, or liver, or lungs. Things that can't be seen by casual observation. This type of mutation is often caused by some type of ongoing medical problem, such as cystic fibrosis in the case of lungs, or alcoholism in the case of liver. At some point the condition becomes immediately life-threatening. Mutavis activates and somehow senses that the problem is a simple malfunction of normal bodily functions, and then solves the problem in the most efficient way possible, by permanently fixing the afflicted organs. Of note is how little extra modification takes place, when these minor modifications were first starting to be discovered across hospitals the world over. It was thought that they might not even be due to Mutavis. The near-zero instance rate of trigger events in this population later proved that Mutavis was indeed the cause. The next 2 categories, selective external mutation and full-body mutation, are really the same thing. It's merely a sliding scale of severity. These are caused by external events such as a stab wound, a fall from a great height, a violent rape, etc. etc. Basically anything that puts the host's life at risk while not actually killing them. These, I believe, are a result of Mutavis trying to solve a situation that has no clear-cut answer. Sure, you can patch a knife wound, But how do you stop the possibility of a knife wound from ever happening again? By covering the body in armor with superior reflexes and your own bladed weapon with the ability to spit acid onto potential attackers. How do you choose? A virus has no brain, no thought process. It can barely even be called alive by our standards. So how does a virus choose? For some insight into this, we turn to the fourth category, catastrophic mutations. You've all heard the horror stories, no doubt. An unfortunate injury resulting in a monstrous, cannibalistic horror creature out of a crazy man's worst nightmares. These are what truly makes Mutated such a feared and reviled affliction. But why do they happen to begin with when most mutations seem largely beneficial? Some research of the injuries involved in these cases shows that most were a result of massive physical trauma, often involving the head. Now, we all know that bad triggers can be the result of a drug-induced, altered mental state. The fact that a traumatic head wound would also obviously hinder mental state suggests a linked cause. It is my belief that Mutated piggybacks on whatever phenomena causes trigger events, and therefore is affected by the host's conscious mind in a similar manner. Now, a lot of this is merely conjecture on my part. It can be difficult to separate cases of catastrophic mutation from other oddities of summer, or even just from regular cases of mutant animals. So keep in mind the data I've managed to collect is not the result of a scientific survey, but merely my own investigations of singular cases. Mutated also tends to handle hallucinogenic or similar recreational drugs quite easily, whereas these drugs are terrible to combine with triggers. But that's a matter for a different day. Today, I wish only to test if massive brain damage truly increases the odds of a catastrophic mutation. To that end, I've assembled a variety of implements with which to do so. Most notably this common N17 lob handgun. I've been told its low-caliber ammo will indeed pierce a skull, but will not do so much damage as to kill a person before Mutated can begin its work. Note to self, do areas of higher gun use or ownership have more frequent occurrences of catastrophic mutation? I'll check into that after we finish up here. Monologue given by Dr. Kevin Killamon Jero to a class of college students before his death at the hands of one of his victims. Apparently we were heading to a hospital. A quick internet search on my phone revealed that it was where humans took their sick and injured for medical care. It wasn't something I had ever really questioned before. But in hindsight it made sense to centralize long-term medical care and vital medical resources. I had sort of assumed that ambulances I saw from time to time were the de facto method of assisting civilians in need of medical help, seeing as they appeared whenever there was a car crash, or street brawl, or sometimes when a human just collapsed. The first time I had seen a human collapse for no reason had scared me, as I thought there was another super picking targets out of the crowd. But I overheard that the man had suffered a heart attack. Research told me that it was a strange condition where the human heart just stops beating, primarily affecting older males. I suppose this was a condition similar to choking from clogged airways. An unfortunate product of the human design, a heart just stopping. So strange. Either way, it's apparently not too big a problem, because the human in question got back up well before the ambulance arrived. I scrolled through the website for E13 General Hospital, a large building just a few blocks north of the red zone. They had several different areas of medicine listed as departments: primary care, rehabilitation, neurology, maternity, emergency, which had a lot more doctors listed than the others, and more. Quite a long list. Oh. There was a Mutated emergency response and care ward. I was starting to feel excitement. This trip had the potential to be a lot more beneficial than I thought. Maybe I could slip into the Mutated ward for a bit and have a look around. Or one of the surgery wards. I'd love to see how humans fixed internal damage without the aid of Mutated. The van rounded a corner. And the front of the hospital came into view. The building itself was a gigantic rectangular structure. About 3 blocks long by 2 blocks wide. But only 2 stories tall. Much shorter than the surrounding structures. The longest side of the building was also the front entrance. And from the design I could tell the place was built for large influxes of patients. Multiple entrances marked as emergency were spaced out along the front side of the building. And a wide approach lane allowed a small army of ambulances to easily enter and disgorge passengers without getting in each other's way. As I watched, 3 ambulances were doing just that. The multiple humans of the medical cast carrying the injured civilians into the building. Let's see. If I was reading the website correctly. Then the humans driving the ambulances were emergency response technicians or EMTs. The ones who did surgeries were surgeons, optometrists, neurologists, nutritionists. So many. There were dozens of specialized personnel for every facet of human biology. Fascinating. Not all of them were located in the hospital itself. The sheer number of specialists and their required resources probably just didn't fit. Were there really that many different facets to a human body? I had dismantled a decent number of them now. And hadn't noticed anything that would require at many areas of study. Skeleton. Musculature. Brain and signal transfer system. Skin and internal pressure maintenance could be counted as 2 systems, I guess. Appendix. The heart. And of course the multiple filter organs like lungs. Liver. Kidneys. Oh. There would be 2 different reproductive systems, one for male. One for female. That increased the count. Though not by much. Had I missed something? It all seemed rather simple. Besides the brain, why would they need so many specialists? Admittedly, I hadn't managed to figure out why they had so many separate and redundant filter organs. But only the single appendix. So there might be subtleties I wasn't seeing. So strange it had to be because of Mutavis. It changed their biology on an individual basis. So maybe they were trying to cover all possible permutations. It seemed like a fruitless endeavor considering the near infinite variations Mutavis might choose. But then again, humans did seem very stubborn when it came to the pursuit of knowledge. A mystery for later. Right now I was more concerned with all the police I was seeing around the hospital premises. Especially since they all appeared to be armored and armed. That's a lot of police. "Mo, don't worry about that," said Fred. "Just don't cause any trouble and they'll ignore you. The red zone basically funds this whole hospital. They know where their salaries come from. Not like anyone wants trouble happening at a hospital anyways. Actually, that reminds me. If either of you are ever in mask and need medical help, get your ass to a hospital. Don't try to tough it out or some stupid shit. Doctors can't reveal anything they find out while treating you," Sandra told me during my interview. I replied. Gregor nodded his confirmation. That whole part of the interview made a lot more sense now. I had figured if worse came to worst I could just kill whoever was trying to unnecessarily treat me. Much harder to do if it was a bunch of doctors in the middle of a hospital. And not just some EMTs down an empty side street. Honestly, I probably should have found out about hospitals a lot sooner. But I had been avoiding flashing lights and sirens whenever possible. And hadn't come near this area while exploring. Exactly how many areas of interest was I missing by being ignorant? Worrisome. I needed to practice proactive scenario envisionment like humans did using movies. While I pondered the best person to surreptitiously ask about interesting places, Brilla drove the car into the rear parking lot. There was a lot less activity on this side of the building. And we eventually parked near what seemed to be some kind of loading dock. Fred went to get a gurney to wheel the body in. Since having 2 helmeted minions carrying a body around in a hospital was too conspicuous, I didn't see why putting it on a gurney was any better. It wasn't a human body anyway. Why would anyone care? Me and Brilla can do this part if you guys would rather wait here, offered Fred. I'll come. I'm interested in meeting this Stitcher you mentioned. As if I was going to miss out on a look inside. Pfft. I think maybe I'll watch the van, said Gregor. Don't much care for hospitals. I found that strange. Hospitals seemed so exciting. Fred led the way while I pushed the gurney. We used the loading dock entrance to enter. Inside were a few workers moving boxes of what I assumed to be medical equipment. Fred walked up to a wide-eyed worker and asked him to go get Stitcher. And he practically ran to do so. The other dock workers quickly made themselves scarce. After a few minutes, a man entered the dock area. He had thin hair despite his young age, and a crooked nose that supported a pair of spectacles. While his eyes were red from lack of rest, they were nonetheless sharp. And he zeroed in on us immediately. Most telling was that he wore a white coat. A scientist. Whoever you've brought me better be at death's door. Do you have any idea how busy I am? He asked. No worries, Stitcher. Should be quick. No medical care today. Just need you to see if you can ID. A super for us, said Fred. I'm not Hellion's personal mortician. He sneered. I've got better things to do than digging through the aftermath of your mistakes. Easy, Doc. I think this one might interest you, said Brilla. And she lifted a corner of the tarp to reveal the Stitch-Trat's head. The stitches and surgical modifications were on full display. You brought a dead rat into my hospital, said Stitcher. He scowled at the body. But after his gaze swept over the extent of the surgical modifications, he sighed. This would be one of the rats from the mall incident yesterday. This one attacked an establishment in the red zone last night. But we think it's the same guy. Ah, yes. That would explain the suddenly expedited interest. Fine. Follow me. And make sure that thing doesn't drip on the floor. We followed Stitcher a bit deeper into the hospital while he continuously grumbled about patients he had to get back to. Several times he pulled aside members of staff to have them go check on active situations. I surmised that his apparent hectic state was an ongoing affair. We arrived at a room labeled morgue. And he had me wheel the rat body in after him. Bodies. Lots and lots of bodies. The room was full of them. And an extended shelf that poked from a small square aperture hinted at more stored away. They were in all shapes and sizes, with a few mutants in the mix as well. I started calculating my odds of being able to eat a few. It was unlikely I'd get a chance. But still. The things I could learn. Stitcher pointed at two people working in the room and ordered them out. Then directed me to move the rat to a large steel table welded to the floor. I hope none of you are squeamish. I can't have my usual assistants help with cowl business, Stitcher announced. I'll be fine, I replied. Fred and Brilla looked a bit more reluctant. Stitcher pulled the tarp off the body and began looking it over. No lacerations. No real blood loss. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma. Rigor mortis hasn't set in yet. Are we certain it's actually dead and not just unconscious? I'd rather not have it jump at me halfway through. I mean it didn't move on the way here, replied Fred. TCH. Which could mean absolutely nothing. One of you stab it in the neck. Over the drain, please. I grabbed the corpse by the head and moved its neck over the drain before doing as asked. The blood didn't so much leak out as ooze out. Definitely not fresh. Fred wasn't looking too good. And Brilla was refusing to look directly at the operating table. I guess they were squeamish. Stitcher finished putting on a different coat, along with a cloth mask to cover his mouth and nose, and approached the rat body. Not the best conditions. But I'm in a hurry. One of you take notes. Or just pay attention. I'm only going over this once. Now then. Stitcher held out his hands. And a strange shimmer effect emerged from under his sleeves and encompassed them. It looked like they had been covered in crystal clear water. He had a power. As I watched, the substance around one of his fingers lengthened to create an edge. And he used it to start dissecting the rat. His power reminded me of Magenta's. But on a smaller, more precise scale. He talked while he worked. And I found it interesting to see how a human analyzed the corpse. The skeletal system is reinforced with metal in several sections. Care was not taken in preserving a normal range of motion. The digestive and muscular systems are mostly untouched. But there is no mismatched scaling with the rat's other organs. So whatever method they used to grow the rat to such a massive size was done properly at least. That's a normal rat size. I think it was modified after it grew that big. I supplied. His eyebrows rose at the information. What metric are you using? Tiny fits in my hand. Small can jump at your face from the floor. Medium is this dead one. And large hits its head on the sewer ceiling. I see. I believe I'll be putting in a request for an extermination crew later. Stitcher kept opening up the corpse. Paying special attention to the individual organs to check them for modification. He was starting to grumble about wasting his time. When he got to a section at the base of the rat's skull. Aha! Here we finally have something interesting. He was pointing at a lump of flesh that looked like brain matter wrapped in bone. It almost looked like my core, but with more fleshy bits. This tumor here is artificial. See the melding of different tissue types. But the design is too structurally demarcated to be a normal cancerous tumor. If my guess is right. There should be yes. Right here. See this. I don't see anything. Precisely. There is no connection between the tumor and the brain. There is no connection with this tumor and anything else in the body. The stitch work on the epidermis is superficial. The metal reinforcing the bones should hinder the creature more than help. And the only piece of functional design isn't connected to anything. This super playing at being a Victor Frankenstein is just that, playing. My hypothesis is that their power does all the heavy lifting in order for this rat to actually function. Any actual surgical work is simply an activation requirement. Or maybe it isn't even necessary at all and they're just a whack job. He started to clean up after the messy dissection. The mask and overcoat went in a bin with other dirty articles of clothing. But his power had kept his hands immaculately clean. So. Any idea who might be doing this, Doc? Asked Fred. He should probably sit down for a bit and rest, he wasn't looking so good. Well. The good news is that it's definitely not an established super. Said Stitcher. A power that makes remote drones from corpses to do the user's bidding far too rare to not have been noticed before. Even if its user is a complete hack. The bad news is that it's probably a new trigger. So it could be almost anyone. Have they announced any demands? Nothing so far. Well, in that case they are probably just a fresh trigger flexing their power. Do try to get rid of this one in a timely manner, please. This type of power tends to cut out if the user is removed. But I'd rather not wait until they have a small army before finding out. Either way. I've wasted enough time on this as it is. Please clean the mess up on your way out, would you? With those words Stitcher walked out of the morgue. And Fred, Brilla, and myself were left alone. Fred and Brilla took one look at the remains of the corpse. Looked at each other. And yelled. Not it. They both ran out of the morgue. Claiming that they need to make sure Gregor is fine. And to take all the time you need. I looked at the large rat corpse. And the bodies throughout the morgue. And the lack of any cameras or humans. It seems that biding my time on reporting the bioweapons had finally paid off. Elation. It was a shame I had filled up the night previous and couldn't actually eat most of the bodies. But I refused to miss out on this opportunity and deconstructed all of them with micro-units. Even the normal human males that weren't mutated, and dumping the dust down the drains to keep the room clean. The final count was 25 bodies. With 15 of them being mutants and 9 of them being female. The mutants were of course the most valuable. One had a chitin composite that was 5.67% more durable. And 2.5% more resistant to stress. But finally having multiple examples of female and male anatomy was useful. So much of a human's appearance was based on their skeletal/muscular structure. And there was only so much you could glean from the surface. The most interesting thing I noticed was that of the 15 mutants, only 6 of them had outer mutations. And the rest all had internal mutations. Modified hearts/lungs/sensory organs. I recorded all of these especially carefully. Hearts were needed to properly distribute microunits. And the improved lung design gave insight on how I could absorb mass from the air much more efficiently. These 2 organ designs I incorporated right away. After I was done making sure the morgue was clean, I decided to have a look around the hospital. Fred and Brilla said I could take as long as I needed. And I still had enough time to meet up with Nicole later as long as I didn't dawdle. I just need to take a taxi to get to the mall and buy Cinnabons. I decided to disguise myself to not draw attention. And stored my mask before covering my suit in fake clothes. My real ones were in a locker back at the base. The extra bodies meant I could discard the layer of fake clothes later and still be topped off on resources. The hospital was laid out in a logical fashion. With very clear demarcations between civilian and staff areas. I considered a doctor disguise to check these. But discarded it as unwise before I knew more about what a doctor did. Whoever had designed the hospital had a clear goal in mind. Which was to expedite treatment and quickly clear the space for fresh patients. Patients would enter from any of the several emergency entrances that serviced the ambulances. And would be shunted into one of the nearby operating rooms. Whichever was appropriate to service their specific injury. Once stable, they were then moved to a series of rooms where the doctors decided if they could be released. Or if they needed to be moved to more permanent care. This middle part of the hospital also seemed to service the less immediate medical concerns of civilians who filtered in from non-emergency entrances on the short sides of the rectangular hospital. The back half of the hospital was the area they released patients. And it had both waiting areas and peripheral features of medical care like the pharmacy. As far as I could tell, all ongoing medical care was moved to the top floor. It made sense now why this building was wider than it was tall. It was designed to be abandoned at a moment's notice. A tall building would be harder to evacuate. And the fact that the hospital was spread over a wide area meant they could build hallways and entrances or exits to be wide and accommodating for fast-moving heavy traffic. Other design features included reinforced alcoves and doors. Redundant structural reinforcement in case parts of the building collapsed. Sloped ramps next to every staircase to wheel patients down. And unnecessary, waist-high walls in the parking lot that would nevertheless be perfect for civilians or guards to duck behind. Whoever designed this building had been fully aware that a place full of injured and scared humans would be a statistically likely location for problematic trigger events. Or they had been expecting an invading army. I decided to keep my exploration brief. The top floor was a lot quieter than the bottom floor. Carpeted surfaces and decorated walls meant that sound didn't echo. Obviously a feature to help patients rest. There were still a lot of doctors wandering around. But I noticed more non-injured civilians as well. I wasn't sure why they were here until I saw one carrying a balloon with "Get Well Soon" printed on it. I suppose humans visit patients they know in the hospital. I explored a bit more. But this part of the hospital wasn't as interesting as I thought it would be. Mainly it was just a bunch of humans resting in beds. The Mutated treatment ward was also blocked off by armed guards. So I couldn't go exploring there. But, as I was about to call an end to my exploration, I found something in a small alcove near the elevators, a vending machine. I had seen and used similar machines at the mall. And I found they were always worth looking into. They often had completely different selections of candy. I scanned the options and located a candy brand I hadn't sampled before, Sour Bombs. Which apple surprise flavor? I slotted a few coins and made my selection. The curled metal hook slowly turning to drop my prize into the dispenser area. And then stopping before it dropped. I pressed the Dispense Item button a few more times. But the electronic label just displayed the price to buy another one. Clicking the Return Coin button also failed to give my money back. The machine stole my coins. I looked around, hoping to spot a staff member or guard I could ask for help. But of course I just so happened to be alone, never around when you needed them to be. Well, the candy wasn't really blocked off entirely. And I was alone. Maybe I could just fix this situation myself. If I was quick, I could have it out of there before anyone saw me. Even if they did, it wasn't like I was doing anything wrong anyways. I had already paid. I reached my arm into the dispenser area. And bent my elbow out of its socket to get it around the hand guard. Then I used the extendable bone structures I implemented in my forearms to get as close to the candy as possible. I was only 2 feet away. So it wouldn't be too hard to stick a tendril to the candy. And maybe I could take 1 or 2 more. After all, it was the machine's fault I was having to expend valuable calories to get the candy. Footsteps. I quickly hooked the pieces of candy I intended to take and pulled. But in my hurry to withdraw my hand, I must have touched some kind of sensor inside the machine. The dispenser area suddenly clamped shut on my arm. Trying to wrench it free didn't work. I'd have to shift it free. Or break the machine. Or abandon the arm to get loose. The human I heard approaching rounded the corner. A dollar bill in hand. He had obviously been planning to use the vending machine. But stopped and stared when he realized it was occupied. Then a small beeping alarm started coming from the machine. Because of course it did. The only good thing about all this was that I recognized the man. Hey Olsen. The machine ate my money. Can you help me out? I recognized him from the brief glimpse back on the training day. Short blonde hair. Medium height. In shape but not really muscular. The only feature that really stood out about him were his vivid blue eyes. Set eyes widened in surprise. And then narrowed in suspicion. Oops. I guess Olsen uses a different name out of costume. It's me. Tofu. Even then he seemed suspicious. Checking around to see if people were in earshot before saying. Prove it. I pulled out my mask. And when even then he seemed suspicious. Shifted the colors along my fake coverings while shifting the joints in my free hand in ways no normal human could possibly imitate. Ack. Alright. I believe you. Just stop that hand thing. How the hell did you recognize me? I was in the fake jacket store when you went through on the training day. I didn't notice you. I like standing in places that are out of the way. And out of line of sight of windows. And near solid cover. And where I can duck out of sight at a moment's notice. It was simply prudent. He sighed and gave me a look that I couldn't quite figure out. Could you help me out now? I asked. I could hear the stomping of boots coming down the hall. And it worried me. He rolled his eyes and appeared to make up his mind. Yeah. Call me Bryson. And if anyone asks, "You're Kale. Try to act natural." The stomping boots were of course a pair of guards who had showed up to see what set off the alarm. They came around the corner with grim faces and hands on their hip holsters, but soon started laughing when they saw my predicament and realized it was a false alarm. One called it in while the other shut off the alarm and tried to figure out how to unwedge me from the machine. The dispenser wasn't clamped anymore, but my arm was still stuck inside from the angle. "How the hell did you bend your arm in there in the first place?" asked the guard. "He's just that special kind of idiot," answered Bryson. Before I could attempt to explain, Bryson kept the guards distracted with small talk to keep their minds off the fact that it should have been impossible to get my arm into the machine, and instead kept their minds focused on how to get me out of it. I took notes on how he led the conversation with anecdotes or small innocuous questions, punctuated with a joke or two to keep the mood friendly, especially the jokes. I still hadn't figured those out. The conversation had turned towards maybe getting a rotosaw to get me out, when another alarm went off. This one was really loud, and there wasn't any way to confuse it with something like a broken vending machine. It rang 3 times before stopping, and both of the guards immediately went for communication devices hanging from their shoulders. While getting the report, they glanced worriedly at me and then towards a direction deeper into the hospital, where I assumed the disturbance happened. "Go. Go," said Bryson, waving them away. "He got it in somehow. I'll get him out with some Vaseline or something. There's gotta be some lying around somewhere." They nodded and took off, more concerned with whatever had set off the alarm than one person with a stuck hand. Bryson checked to make sure they were really gone before giving me the all clear. I quickly shifted a bit to withdraw my arm, with the candy. "So, what exactly are you doing here?" asked Bryson. "I'm on a job. We were taking one of the stitched rat corpses that attacked the red zone to be analyzed by Stitcher." Heh. I bet he didn't much appreciate the irony. "So, if you're on a job, why the hell are you stealing candy from a vending machine?" "I paid for it." He rolled his eyes. "Look. Just get back to the job. And try not to get into any more trouble. These was a one-time thing. Next time this happens when I'm off the clock you're on your own. Got it?" "Yes, Bryson." That meant I owed him lunch. "Good. Now I gotta get back to what I was doing. I'll catch you later." "What about the alarm? Shouldn't we evacuate?" "That wasn't an evacuation alarm. That was just to call some guards for aggressive medical care. Goes off like twice a day. It's only a real problem if all staff. Please begin evacuation procedures. Stage 1. All civilians please calmly exit the building. Do not crowd staff. That happens." Finished Bryson. "Now do we evacuate?" "Yeah. Get back to your team. I'll see you later." "Where are you going?" "None of your business, kid. Remember. You didn't see me here." And with that he jogged back the way he came. I headed back to where the van was parked, using the route I took from the morgue since it was the opposite direction of where the guards went. Hospital staff streamed down the halls to get to patients on the top floor. From their hurried but unpanicked demeanor, I gathered they were all quite practiced at this routine. One nurse finally took notice of me, thinking that I was a lost civilian, and tried to direct me towards the normal civilian route. My mask started beeping in my pocket while she talked, so I decided to just head in the direction she was pointing so I could check it. "What did you do, Fred?" was the message displayed. I messaged back that I had nothing to do with it. "Get back here pronto. Fred." Yes, yes. I was on my way. Annoying. This whole thing was going to make me late to meet up with Nicole. I'd need to call her and let her know. I dialed her. Hello. Hey Nicole. It's Tofu. I kinda figured, huh? What's up? Just wanted to let you know I'm probably going to be running a little late. I got called into work for a short job this morning. But it's running a bit longer than expected. And it might run even longer from the looks of it. I had finally caught up with the flow of civilian traffic coming from upstairs. Apparently someone up ahead was pushing. Because the crowd was stalled at a T intersection. And a few people were starting to panic. Oh. Well, we could put it off for today. No. I'll be there. Just got caught up in an evacuation at the hospital. What? Why are you at the hospital? It's fine, Nicole. I was just making a delivery. Remember, I work at a warehouse. Well. Geez. Be careful, okay? Why are they evacuating? The crowd down the hall finally started moving again. But the flow of traffic was reversing instead of continuing to the exits. Humans were running away from the left corridor. And were picking any direction to run in. A final ripple of the crowd pushed the last of the humans into view. Some of them were actually tossed through the air. What followed them was a rat. At least, I think it was a rat. It had a body like that of the medium-sized rat we brought Stitcher. But where its head should have been was a human torso. What looked like 8 arms, all from different mutants, had been stitched to the torso's sides. And the rat's head was sewn on to where the human head would normally be. It tried to hiss at the crowd in front of it. But what came out was a weird gurgling bellow. Tofu, what the hell was that? What's going on over there? I think the hospital has a rat problem.